In 1956, the SS Andrea Doria was more than just a ship. It was a floating masterpiece, a symbol of Italy's recovery and pride after the war. It was the country's largest, fastest, and by all accounts, its safest ocean liner. When you stepped on board, you were stepping into a world of luxury, but for all its beauty and engineering, this ship would be remembered for something else entirely. On July 25th of that year, the Andrea Doria was on its way to the United States, gliding through the Atlantic. But as it neared the East Coast, it sailed into a wall of thick, heavy fog. Following standard procedure, the captain slowed the massive vessel down to a crawl and sounded the ship's powerful fog whistle, its deep moan cutting through the eerie silence. A little while later, another ship entered that same blanket of fog. This was the SS Stockholm, a Swedish ocean liner. The problem was the crew of the Stockholm had no idea the Andrea Doria was anywhere near them. Both ships were equipped with radar, which was still relatively new technology at the time. And unfortunately, on this night, both crews were misinterpreting the signals they were seeing on their screens. They saw blips, but didn't understand what those blips truly represented. Critically, neither vessel made any attempt to communicate with the other as they charged blindly toward one another through the dense gray mist. Eventually, the moment came when the two ships were close enough for visual contact. Lookouts on both decks would have seen the ghostly silhouette of another liner suddenly emerge from the fog. But by then, it was far too late. A collision was unavoidable. At 11:10 p.m., the reinforced ice-breaking bow of the Stockholm slammed directly into the side of the Andrea Doria. The steel tore through the hull like it was paper, penetrating over 40 feet deep into the Italian ship before wrenching itself back out. The impact was catastrophic. It instantly killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria. On the Stockholm, 5 crew members lost their lives. When the news of the disaster broke, it became an international headline. Every major news outlet scrambled to cover the story. In the United States, ABC News assigned the story to one of their most respected correspondents, a man named Edward Morgan. But what his colleagues and his audience didn't know was that Edward was carrying an unimaginable personal burden. His 14-year-old daughter, Linda Morgan, was a passenger on the Andrea Doria. Just moments before he was scheduled to go on the air to report this story to the nation, he was given the devastating news. Linda was among the missing, and she was presumed to be dead. There was absolutely nothing he could do. He was miles away, trapped in a news studio, waiting for scraps of information just like everyone else. Despite this incredible weight on his shoulders, Edward Morgan went on the air. He sat at his desk, looked into the camera, and delivered the story of the tragic collision. He spoke with his usual calm and professional composure, never once letting the public see the personal hell he was going through. He never mentioned that his own daughter was out there somewhere in the cold Atlantic, her fate unknown. But after he finished his broadcast and the cameras turned off, another, much stranger story began to emerge from the chaos of the rescue efforts. It centered on a young girl. Apparently, this girl had been asleep in her cabin on the Andrea Doria in one of the very rooms that had taken a direct hit from the Stockholm. After the crash, she woke up completely disoriented. She was in the dark, surrounded by wreckage, and she had no idea where she was. Frightened, she began to cry out for her mother. Meanwhile, on board the Stockholm, a crewman heard the faint cries of a girl. He followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from the front of the ship. He ran towards the bow, which was now a twisted, mangled mess of steel from the collision. And when he got there, he saw something that made no sense at all. Perched precariously on the destroyed bow of Stockholm was a bed. And on that bed was a young girl. She was shaken, but she was alive, so relatively unharmed. That 14-year-old girl was Linda Morgan. It turns out, in a 1 in a million freak occurrence, when Stockholm's bow sliced into the side of the Andrea Doria, it had acted like a giant scoop. It had carved out the section of the ship where Linda's bed was, lifting her up and essentially dragging her into the wreckage of Stockholm's bow. Then, as the two ships pulled apart, Stockholm brought the bed and Linda with it out of the sinking liner. She had been transferred from one ship to another in the middle of a catastrophic collision, all while she was asleep. When Edward Morgan received the news that his daughter was not only alive, but was the so-called miracle girl of the Andrea Doria, he was completely overcome with emotion. He went back on the air, but this time the professional composure was gone. He spoke to the nation as a father. He told them about his daughter, about her incredible story of survival. He also spoke about how difficult it had been to deliver the news of a tragedy when it was so deeply personal, when it involved someone he loved more than anything. Linda would make a full physical recovery, suffering only a broken arm. But emotionally, the scars ran deep. She would struggle for the rest of her life with immense survivor's guilt. Her stepfather and her younger half-sister, who had been in the cabin with her, were both killed in the crash. She had survived, but she had lost her family in the process. On the 27th of April, 1997, a farmer in a rural village in Indonesia was doing what he did every day. He was walking his livestock through a dense sugarcane field near his home. As he made his way through the tall stalks, he suddenly tripped on something hidden in the dirt. After he picked himself up and dusted himself off, he looked down to see what had caught his foot. It was a strange mound of dirt. It just seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. He was curious and wanted to start digging right then and there, but he knew he wasn't on his own property. So he decided against it. Instead, he headed back to his village. He went straight to the village leader and told him about the strange pile of dirt he'd found out in the sugarcane field. He suggested that maybe the leader should go take a look and see what was under it. The village leader agreed it sounded odd, so he gathered a few other men from the village and they all walked back out to the field. They found the mound right where the farmer said it would be. The first thing they did was take a long stick and poke it into the pile of dirt. The stick slid in easily. The dirt was soft and loosely packed. But when they pulled the stick back out, a horrible stench filled the air. It was a smell of decay, and it was coming from inside that mound. Worried about what they might find, the men decided this was something they shouldn't handle on their own. They left the mound alone, went back to the village, and immediately contacted the authorities. But when they explained the situation, the authorities told them something surprising. They told the men to go back out to the field, uncover whatever was under the dirt, and then report back on what they found. So the village leader and some more men returned to the strange mound. They brought shovels this time, and they began to dig. It didn't take long before their shovels hit something soft buried just beneath the surface. They put the shovels aside and began to clear the dirt away carefully with their hands. And that's when they saw it. A woman's face looking right back at them. It appeared she had been buried in a standing position up to her neck, and then someone had just piled dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities finally came out to the scene. They were able to identify the body. It belonged to a 21-year-old local woman named Dewey. Police began asking around the village, trying to piece together her last known movements. They learned that the last time anyone had seen her was 3 days earlier. She had left her house to run an errand, and after that, she had simply vanished. Just a few hours after Dewey's body was discovered, a 5-year-old boy who drove a rickshaw came to the police station. He had information. He told police that 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, the very same day Dewey was last seen, she had hired him for a ride. When she got into his rickshaw, he asked her where she wanted to go. But her answer was strange. She told him she couldn't give him a specific destination. Instead, she just wanted him to start driving in a particular direction, and she would give him more instructions as they got closer. This really intrigued the young driver. It was a very unusual request. After they had been driving for a bit, he turned to her again and asked if she could tell him anything more about where they were going. He told her it was weird that she was being so secretive. Finally, Dewey gave in. She told him she was going to see the shaman. In that part of the world, a shaman is someone believed to have a connection to the spirit world, someone who can use magic to cure the sick or bring good fortune. The rickshaw driver thought it was odd that this young woman was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and being so secretive about it, but he dropped her off as requested and hadn't thought much of it again until he heard that she had been found dead. Armed with this new information, the police went to see the shaman. He was a 5-year-old man named Ahmad Siraji. They asked him if he had been with Dewey on the night of April 24th. At first, Siraji said no. He claimed he hadn't seen her and had no idea what could have happened to her. But the police didn't believe him. They got a warrant to search his house, and inside they found some of Dewey's personal belongings. When confronted with this evidence, Siraji's story changed. He calmly told the police that he had been lying. He said he had a confession to make. And then, in a very nonchalant and matter-of-fact tone, he told them that he had not only killed Dewey, but he had also killed dozens of other women in the exact same way, and he told them they were all buried in that same sugarcane field. The police went back out to the field and began a systematic search. They quickly realized the first mound was not an isolated thing. There were mounds of dirt scattered all over the place. And under each one, they found the body of a woman buried up to her neck. By the time the excavation was finished, they had found the bodies of 42 different women. But authorities believed that was just a guess. There could be even more that they hadn't found. During his trial, Ahmad Siraji explained in detail why he did what he did. He said that back in 1986, 11 years earlier, he had a vivid dream. In the dream, his deceased father appeared to him. His father gave him a specific instruction. He had to drink the saliva of 70 women. If he did this, his father told him he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't dismiss it as just a strange dream. He fully believed he had just had a real conversation with the spirit of his dead father. So he decided to do exactly as he was told. The only problem was his father hadn't explained how he was supposed to get the saliva from these 70 women. After thinking about it for a few days, Siraji decided that the most efficient way to complete his task would be to kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began spreading a rumor around his village. He told people he was a powerful shaman with supernatural abilities. Specifically, he claimed he could grant women everlasting beauty and great riches. And many people, desperate for a better life, believed him. As the rumor spread to surrounding villages, women started coming to him requesting his services. He would tell them to come back to his house late at night when it was completely dark, and he would stress that they must not tell anyone where they were going. Once a woman arrived, she would come inside and pay him a fee, which was roughly the equivalent of $300. Then he would tell her that to receive her beauty and riches, they needed to perform a special ritual. They would leave his house, cut through a nearby cemetery, and walk out into the vast sugarcane field. After walking for a while, Siraji would stop. He would hand the woman a shovel and tell her to dig a hole in the ground, assuring her that this was all part of the ritual. He would stand and watch as she dug a hole that was about waist deep. Then he would tell her to get into the hole and place her hands down by her sides. If the woman seemed nervous, he would just reassure her again, telling her that this was all perfectly normal, that lots of women had done this before, and that it was completely safe. So she would get in the hole. Siraji would then take the shovel and begin filling the hole back in with dirt, packing it tightly around her until she was completely immobilized from the waist down. As they leave his wint, with the woman trapped and helpless, Siraji would pull out a length of cable. He would wrap it around her neck and strangle her to death. Once she was dead, he would pull her body out of the hole and forcibly extract her saliva. After that, he would dig the hole a little deeper, place her body back inside, but he would make sure her head was still sticking out of the ground. He would then orient her body so that her face was looking directly towards his house. He believed that having the spirits of these women constantly looking at him day and night gave him more power. As for Dewey, his last victim, he said that when she first came to his house and paid the fee, she got scared. She was worried about going out into the dark field to do the ritual. So, Siraji told her to wait. He went into another room where his wife was and told her what was happening. He said he was going to kill this girl and that he needed his wife's help to calm her down. His wife, who he claimed had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, apparently went along with it immediately. She came into the room and assured Dewey that everything was fine. She told her they had done this ritual many times before and that it was perfectly safe. She even offered to go with them to make sure Dewey felt comfortable. Hearing this from another woman put Dewey at ease, and she agreed to go. The trio, Siraji, his wife, and Dewey, left the house, walked through the cemetery, and went out into the field. But only 2 of them came back. Ahmad Siraji was executed by firing squad in 2008. His wife was sentenced to life in prison. Around midnight on the 3rd of September 1986, Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were driving home. As they pulled onto their quiet street in western Montana, they saw something unusual. There was a camper parked right in front of their house. Neither of them recognized it. When they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out of the car and walked over to the camper. He peered inside the window to see if anyone was in there. And there was. A man was asleep in the front seat. Doug didn't want to wake him. He walked back to his wife, and they talked it over. They figured the man was probably just a traveler who had randomly pulled over on their street to get some sleep. They decided that he would most likely be gone by the morning. So, the couple went inside their house and started getting ready for bed. A little while later, Doug gathered up all the trash from inside the house to take it out to the bin. As he stepped outside, he saw a figure standing in his front lawn. It was the same guy who had been sleeping in the camper. Doug cautiously walked down his front steps. He called out to the man, asking what he was doing there. The man immediately put his hands up and said he didn't mean any harm. He introduced himself as Wayne Nance and said he actually worked with Doug's wife Kristen at a local furniture store. Wayne then launched into a story. He said he happened to be driving down their street earlier in the day and he saw someone standing outside one of their windows looking into the house. He knew it was Kristen's house, and he could see that no one was home. So he decided he would just park his camper out front to try and scare the person off, and he would wait for Kristen and Doug to get back. But by the time they arrived, he had fallen asleep. Doug was completely caught off guard by all of this. Here was a guy on his property talking about some other guy who was lurking around his property. It was unsettling. He asked Wayne if he had seen the prowler again after that first time. Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he explained that he didn't have a flashlight. He then made an offer. He suggested that if Doug went inside and got some flashlights, the 2 of them could walk the property together and make sure nobody was hiding in the dark. Doug thanked him for the offer. It seemed like a neighborly thing to do, even though it was a strange situation. He said to Wayne, "Why don't you come inside the house and I'll go look for those flashlights?" So Doug led the way, opening his front door. As soon as Wayne Nance stepped inside the house and shut the door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he had been hiding. He viciously smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug stumbled and turned around, and Wayne hit him again, this time across the face. Before long, the 2 men were on the ground, struggling for their lives. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the loud commotion. She came running down the stairs and saw a horrific scene at the bottom. Her husband, Doug, was bleeding badly from his head, curled up on the ground, trying to protect himself. And standing over him was Wayne, her coworker, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could even process what was happening, Wayne noticed her on the stairs. He pulled out a pistol and aimed it directly at her. He ordered her to come down and tie up her husband's arms and legs. Kristen was in total shock. She was hoping this was just a robbery, that if she complied, they would take what they wanted and leave them alive. So she did as she was told. She walked down the stairs, and Wayne threw her some cord. She tied up her husband's arms and legs. Afterwards, Wayne led Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he tied her up as well. With the couple restrained, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still lying on the ground. He grabbed Doug by the legs and dragged him down a flight of stairs into the basement. He tied Doug to a pole, and then he savagely beat him with the metal pipe. After the beating, Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way to the hilt. He pulled the knife out, and Doug slumped over motionless. Wayne went back upstairs to the second floor to check on Kristen. He saw that she had managed to get partially free from her restraints and was reaching for the landline phone next to the bed. He jumped on top of her and tied her up again, this time making sure the knots were secure. Confident that she couldn't escape, he went back downstairs one more time to make sure Doug was dead. When he got to the basement, he saw Doug still slouched over in the exact same position he had left him. Wayne assumed Doug must be dead. So he went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. After Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head wounds and a deep stab wound to his chest, managed to wriggle out of his restraints. He hobbled over to a workbench. Doug was a gunsmith, and he had a rifle lying on the bench. He found a single round on the table and loaded it into the rifle. Then he walked over to the base of the stairs. He raised the rifle and slowly, painfully, made his way up to the main floor. He didn't see Wayne on the first floor, but he could hear his wife screaming upstairs. He made his way to the next set of stairs and began to climb, his rifle raised and ready. At the top of the second floor stairs was a hallway that went left and right. As Doug climbed, he could hear his wife's screams coming from a bedroom off to the left, out of his line of sight. He could also hear the sound of heavy footsteps running down the hall directly towards him. Doug positioned himself in the stairwell. He took aim with his rifle at about chest height, pointing it towards the corner where the hallway turned. He waited for his attacker to appear. As soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife still in his hand, Doug fired. The single shot struck Wayne right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, completely shocked. He began to stagger down the hall. Doug, now out of ammunition, turned his rifle around and held it like a baseball bat. He walked down the hall and just started smashing Wayne as Wayne stumbled and tried to get away. Finally, Wayne managed to break free from Doug and charge into the bedroom where Kristen was. He grabbed his pistol, turned around, and fired 3 shots towards the doorway where Doug was now standing. One round hit Doug in the leg. The other 2 missed, but Doug was unfazed. He just walked up to Wayne and began bashing his head in with the butt of the rifle. He hit him so many times that the stock of the rifle shattered and the metal barrel of the gun bent into an L shape. At some point during the vicious beating, Wayne dropped his pistol. Doug saw it, grabbed the gun, and fired the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics arrived a short time later. Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would eventually make full recoveries. As for Wayne Nance, he died the following day from his injuries. In the aftermath, police began investigating Wayne Nance to figure out who this man was. And what they discovered was chilling. They found evidence that almost certainly proved Wayne Nance was a serial killer connected to at least 6 cold case murders that had occurred between 1974 and 1986. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these crimes before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the 20th of June, 2004, the dinner rush was in full swing at a seafood restaurant in Orange County, California. In the middle of the chaos, a frantic customer rushed in asking about a takeout order. The manager quickly grabbed the food and brought it to the counter. But as he rang the customer up, he noticed something strange. The customer kept glancing nervously over their shoulder toward the door, their fingers tapping anxiously against the countertop. And the second the transaction was finished, the customer grabbed the food and literally sprinted out of the restaurant. The manager just stood there for a moment, watching them disappear into the night. In all his years working there, he had never seen anybody run out of the restaurant like that before. But within seconds, another phone started ringing, another customer stepped up to the counter, and the strange encounter was quickly forgotten. That is, until a few days later when police officers showed up at the restaurant and asked the manager to describe that customer in as much detail as possible. On Monday, the 21st of June 2004, 72-year-old Jane Thompson was driving her car through the quiet, sun-drenched streets of Laguna Niguel, California. She was on her way home from a weekend trip up in Los Angeles, which was about 50 miles north. And for Jane, this drive was always a welcome part of the trip. LA was chaotic, a whirlwind of activity and constant noise. This drive home was her time to be by herself, to let the silence settle in, and to just decompress from the energy of the big city. Jane used to be a part of that world. She had lived in Los Angeles for decades, building a very successful career in the film industry. She had moved to Laguna Niguel about 7 years earlier after she retired, and the move had been a total lifestyle change. Her career in LA had been fast-paced, demanding, and exciting. She had started as an assistant to some very important people in Hollywood, then became an award-winning producer, and later a sought-after decorator for various Hollywood celebrities. It was a glamorous life, filled with parties and premieres and powerful people. And even though Jane was at her core a pretty quiet person who really appreciated her alone time, like she was right now, it had still been a tough transition. It was hard to leave behind the glitz of Hollywood for the slow, relaxed pace of a suburban community. A big part of that difficulty was because her girlfriend, Marion Reese, still lived up in LA. Jane had known Marion for decades. Their story started professionally. Marion owned a production company, and Jane had produced a lot of successful projects for her. They were great colleagues, then they became good friends. And then, at some point years ago, that working friendship blossomed into a full-blown romance. They had been deeply involved ever since. And even though they now lived over an hour's drive apart, they made it work. They saw each other all the time, spending weekends together either in LA or Laguna Niguel. In fact, Jane was already planning to head back to LA again that coming Friday. They had tickets to the opera, which was one of their favorite things to do together. And then, just a week after that, Marion was going to be joining Jane for a long-awaited cruise to Europe. It was going to be the trip of a lifetime for them. But for now, Jane was just enjoying the drive, looking out her window at the familiar scenery. As she passed a cluster of houses, she saw a familiar face. It was her friend, Mary Larkin, out in her front yard tending to her garden. Jane had known Mary for years. Since moving to Laguna Niguel, Mary had become her closest friend in town. They had spent countless nights sitting on one of their patios, talking for hours and sharing a bottle of wine. Sometimes, Mary's next-door neighbor, Karen, would join them, and she had become a close friend to Jane as well. So naturally, Jane slowed her car down, rolled down the window, and called out a friendly hello. She reminded Mary that they were overdue for one of their wine nights, and that they had to have one soon before she left for her big cruise. Mary looked up from her flowers, smiled, and nodded enthusiastically. She promised she would definitely give Jane a call to set something up. After they said their goodbyes, Jane put the car back in drive and continued on her way. A few minutes later, she saw the entrance to her condo complex up ahead. She put on her blinker and turned in. Soon, she was surrounded by rows of mostly identical units with their distinct orange-tiled roofs, all packed closely together on a quiet hillside. Jane absolutely loved her neighborhood. It was peaceful, it was less than 4 miles from the ocean, and she just felt completely safe and comfortable there. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, a place where everyone seemed so warm and welcoming. And that sense of community meant the world to Jane. She didn't have any children or any living relatives. In many ways, she was on her own. So it was a wonderful feeling to know that her neighbors were all looking out for her. As Jane pulled her car into her garage and stepped out, she looked across the street and saw her teenage neighbor, Sam Nelson, shooting baskets in his driveway. Jane smiled and tried to get his attention, raising her hand to wave a simple hello. But when the boy looked over and saw her, his face fell. He immediately put his head down, dropped the basketball, and quickly rushed inside his house, slamming the door behind him. Jane sighed. She understood why he was acting that way. He was clearly deeply embarrassed. You see, Sam was what some people might call a troubled kid. And just this past Friday, while she was out, he had broken into her house and taken some of her jewelry. But Sam wasn't as clever as he thought he was. Jane had a good idea of who was responsible, and it didn't take her long to figure out for sure that it was him. So, before she left for her weekend trip to LA, she had gone over and confronted him about it. She told him she knew what he did and that he was never to do it again. The boy was obviously mortified, completely ashamed of being caught. But Jane had also told Sam something else. She told him she wasn't going to call the police. After all, Sam was only 15 years old. He had just made a really dumb mistake. And in Jane's mind, Sam was a part of her beloved community. And even though he had done something wrong, something that violated her home and her trust, she still wanted to look out for him. Plus, if she was being honest with herself, he hadn't taken anything that was particularly valuable or anything she couldn't live without. So, she felt like she was just giving him a second chance. It wasn't a big deal. At the time, Sam was obviously very appreciative. You could see the relief wash over his face when he realized he wasn't going to get in any real trouble. But it was also clear now that he wanted absolutely nothing to do with Jane. Just the sight of her waving at him was enough to send him running in shame. But for Jane, she figured maybe that was for the best. And so, after watching Sam disappear into his house, she just shrugged, turned around, and headed inside her own home. Jane spent the next few days settling back into her routine. She did her volunteer shift at the local library, she went on long walks with her weekly walking group, and she prepared for her upcoming trips. And before she knew it, it was Thursday evening, June 24th, and it was almost time to head back to LA. That night, the night before she was set to leave, Jane stood in her kitchen making herself a simple pasta dinner. As she stirred the sauce, she thought about what outfit she was going to wear for the opera with Marion the next night. After she ate, she cleaned up her dishes and then settled onto the couch in the living room to watch some television. Her plan was to only watch a little bit, maybe an hour or so, and then get some packing done for her trip. But she was tired from the week, and pretty quickly she felt her eyelids getting heavy. Soon, she was fast asleep right there on her couch. 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, Jane's friend and neighbor, Mary Larkin, the woman she had seen in the garden, drove up to Jane's house. Their other friend, Karen Hamara, was in the passenger seat. As they got out of the car, Mary could feel an undeniable knot tightening in her stomach. It was a feeling that had been growing steadily all day, ever since Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese, had called her from LA. Marion had sounded panicked. She said that Jane had never shown up in LA for their opera date on Friday, and now she wasn't answering any of her phone calls. Marion had called over and over, but every call went straight to the answering machine. When Mary heard this, she immediately became very worried. It just wasn't like Jane. She was reliable. She was considerate. She would never just flake on people, especially not Marion, without calling to explain why. And given Jane's age, Mary's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenarios. Maybe she had fallen. Maybe she'd had some kind of medical emergency at home and couldn't get to the phone. Maybe she was hurt and needed help. That would explain why nobody could get in touch with her. So after she hung up with Marion, Mary tried calling Jane a few times herself, but she got the same result, the answering machine. With her anxiety growing, Mary had gone over to her neighbor Karen's house and asked her if she would come with her to Jane's condo just to check on her and make sure she was okay. On their short drive over, Mary had tried to convince herself that everything would be fine, that there was a simple explanation for all of this. But now, as she walked up Jane's driveway, that knot in her stomach tightened even more. She could see a few newspapers, still rolled up in their plastic sleeves, piled up at the end of the driveway. That was not a good sign. It meant Jane hadn't been outside to get them for at least a couple of days. So Mary hurried right up the driveway, went to the front door, and started knocking loudly. She and Karen stood there on the porch, listening, but they couldn't hear a single sound coming from inside the house. No television, no movement, nothing. Nobody was coming to the door. Finally, after a few minutes of knocking and calling Jane's name, they gave up on the front door. They left the porch and decided to walk around to the back of the condo to try the back door. And when the two women got into Jane's small, tidy backyard, Mary froze. She could see the sliding glass door that led into Jane's living room. And it was clearly, undeniably, wide open. It wasn't just unlocked, it was slid open several inches. Mary and Karen stood there in the yard and just started yelling through the open door, calling Jane's name over and over, hoping for any kind of response. But all they heard was silence. Eventually, Karen took a hesitant step towards the open door, as if she was going to go inside to look for their friend. But Mary instinctively reached out and grabbed her arm. "Don't," she said, her voice shaking. Mary could barely think straight. Her mind was racing with terrible possibilities. But some gut feeling, some primal instinct, told her that they should not go in there. It just didn't feel safe. And so instead, the two women backed away slowly, left the backyard, and went to go call the police. A few minutes later, Mary and Karen stood out on the street in front of Jane's house, watching as a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. The two women immediately went over to the two deputies who got out of the car and tried to explain the situation as calmly as they could. They told them that their friend wasn't answering her phone, that she had missed important plans, and that her back door was wide open, which was just so strange and out of character. They just didn't know what was going on, but they were very, very worried. The officers listened patiently, then asked Mary and Karen to show them this open door. So they all walked around the side of the condo and into the backyard. When they got there, Mary watched as one of the officers walked right up to the open sliding door. He didn't go in. He just stuck his head inside and began to look around. And as soon as he did that, Mary could see his whole body tense up. It was like he had seen something inside that immediately put him on high alert. Mary blurted out, "What is it? What's wrong?" But the officer looking into the home didn't respond to her. Instead, he pulled his head back out, turned to his partner, and spoke in a low, serious voice. There, he told him to secure the scene and call for backup. There was someone inside, and he could already tell they were deceased. About an hour later, at around 6 in the evening on the 27th of June, 2004, Detective Daniel Salado stopped his cruiser in front of a condo in Laguna Niguel, California. The call from dispatch hadn't given him much information, just that an older woman had been found dead in her home and that the circumstances were suspicious. When Salado got out of his car, he could see that the scene was already very active. There was yellow police tape stretched across the condo's front door and blocking off the driveway. Just inside that perimeter, he saw a uniformed officer speaking to two women who were crying and looked visibly distraught. Dozens of other officers and crime scene technicians were scattered around the property, beginning the slow, meticulous process of collecting evidence. One of the deputies saw Salado arrive and hurried over to give him an update. The deputy confirmed that the deceased woman had been identified as the owner of the condo, a 72-year-old, named Jane Thompson. And from the looks of it, it was not a natural death. It appeared she had been attacked. It looked like a murder. Her two friends, the two women who were still standing in the driveway talking to the police, had been the ones to call for a wellness check. The first responding officers had found Jane lying on the floor in her living room. They had been able to get inside through her sliding back door, the deputy explained, because the door was already open when they arrived. Salado glanced back over at the two crying women. He told the deputy to make sure they stuck around. After he took a look inside, he definitely wanted to speak to them. As the deputy hurried off to relay the message, Salado walked around to the back of the house. When he got there, he saw that not only was the sliding glass door open, but there were no obvious signs of a forced entry around the frame or the lock. That could mean a couple of things. Either it had been left unlocked, or maybe Jane had known her attacker and willingly let them into her home. Salado took a deep breath and stepped inside the condo. Right away, the scene was chaotic. Technicians were everywhere, dusting for prints, taking photographs, carefully documenting every detail. And what he saw was blood. There was blood spatter on the walls and on the furniture. And then, when he looked down at the floor, he saw Jane's body. She was lying face down, positioned between her couch and her coffee table. There was a large, dark pool of blood around her head. Salado crouched down next to her to get a better look. The wounds were brutal. Her head had been so badly pulverized that Salado could see parts of her skull, the actual bone, and he could see clear breaks in that bone. Her skull was shattered. Now, Salado knew he would have to wait for the official autopsy report to be sure, but to his experienced eye, it was very clear what had happened here. Somebody had taken some kind of heavy, blunt object and beaten this woman over and over and over again. A couple of minutes later, Salado stood back up. Based on the sheer extent of Jane's injuries, it seemed obvious to him that this was a frenzied, rage-filled attack. It was personal, and it had likely happened very, very quickly. Or maybe the attack happened in a way that Jane was completely caught off guard, because aside from the awful trauma to her head, she didn't appear to have any other wounds. There were no defensive injuries on her arms or hands. It didn't seem like she had tried to fight back or protect herself at all. And other than the blood spatter, the room around her showed no signs of a struggle. Nothing was overturned, nothing was broken. It was as if she was just standing or lying right here, and someone destroyed her, and the blood went everywhere. Salado left the living room and began to search the rest of her condo. He went into her bedroom, he searched her closets, he went through the small office, and he checked the kitchen. But there were no signs of anybody ransacking the place. There was no obvious theft that had taken place, at least not at first glance. He saw expensive electronics, a nice television, a stereo system, all still sitting out in the open. To Salado, at least right now, he was pretty sure this was not a simple robbery gone wrong. This felt different. As he was finishing his initial walkthrough of the condo, another officer called Salado back into the kitchen. When Salado went over, he saw the officer was standing by the landline phone's answering machine. The officer told Salado that there were a bunch of new, unplayed messages on it. He had checked the times, and the messages started on the morning of Friday, June 25th. Salado was immediately interested in that. It was a huge piece of information because it helped them start to build a timeline. If Jane had stopped answering her phone by Friday morning, then that meant she could have died sometime overnight on Thursday the 24th, or maybe even in the early morning hours before that first message came through on the 25th. At the very least, it gave them a window. Salado told the officer to be sure to log the tape from the machine into evidence. Then Salado went back to the living room where Jane's body was and where the technicians were still working. He just stood there for a moment, his arms crossed, thinking about his next move. Considering the attack had all the signs of being highly emotional, Salado felt confident that Jane's killer was someone who knew her, someone who was deeply, personally angry with her. So, the first people he needed to speak to were those who were closest to Jane, people like her family, her friends, or maybe even a romantic partner. Jane appeared to live alone, so he hoped that other people in the neighborhood, or maybe those two women who called the police, could tell him more about her personal life, her relationships, and give him a solid place to start his investigation. So Salado gathered a few officers, and they all headed outside to begin asking some questions. When he got back outside, Salado could see that a small crowd had formed. A group of what he assumed were residents of the complex were gathered at the edge of the police perimeter, watching the activity with concerned looks on their faces. Salado understood why. Brutal homicides like this one almost never happened in a quiet area like Laguna Niguel. He knew there was probably going to be a lot of panic and a lot of rumors spreading through this tight-knit community because of this. And based on the literal layout of the complex, the fact that all these condos were practically on top of each other, he knew that those rumors would likely spread very, very quickly. But there was a potential upside to that. The fact that these condos were so tightly packed together also gave Salado an advantage. It meant that it was very likely that somebody might have heard something or seen something that could help them break this case wide open. Just then, another police cruiser pulled up in front of the house, and a detective named Brian Sutton stepped out of the car. When Salado saw who it was, he immediately felt a sense of relief. Salado worked extremely well with Detective Sutton. They were a good team, and conducting interviews was their specialty. As a duo, they just had an instinct for asking the right questions, the kinds of questions that got people talking and opening up. So, Salado hurried over to Sutton and quickly brought him up to speed on everything he had learned so far. Once Sutton was briefed, they went right over to the two women who had called 911. Salado was eager to interview them as key witnesses. But he also wasn't ruling out the idea that they could be suspects. He was sure this had to be a personal crime, and these two women clearly had some kind of close relationship with Jane since they were the ones who had come over to check on her. When Salado and Sutton reached the women, he could tell they had calmed down quite a bit from when he had first seen them. They were still upset, but they were composed enough to tell the detectives their names, Mary and Karen. They then explained that they were good friends with Jane and that they had come over to check on her because Mary had gotten a worried phone call from Jane's girlfriend, a woman named Marion Reese, who lived in L.A. They said Marion had been worried because Jane had not shown up in L.A. for plans they had, and so she was trying to find out where she was and if she was okay. This immediately made Salado's ears perk up. A girlfriend. He asked Mary for Marion's contact information. As he jotted down Marion's phone number, Sutton asked the two women where they were on the night of Thursday the 24th or the early morning of the 25th. Both women said they had solid alibis. Now, the detectives would still have to confirm those alibis, because anybody can say they have one. But for right now, Salado was comfortable provisionally ruling Mary and Karen out as suspects. They both seemed genuinely stunned and horrified by Jane's murder. And while it seemed like they were good friends with Jane, he wasn't getting the sense that they had the kind of intense, complicated closeness that might have led to such a vicious and personal attack. So he told the two women they were free to go home. Then Salado nodded to Sutton, and the two of them left the women and headed towards the crowd of neighbors to ask some more questions. The next morning, on Monday, June 28th, Salado was behind the wheel of his cruiser with Sutton in the passenger seat. They were nearing the end of their long drive up to Los Angeles. Their destination was the home of Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese. Salado was eager to get her statement because, at this point, they didn't have many other leads to go on. The forensics team hadn't found any usable DNA or fingerprints at the crime scene that could be tested against future suspects. And the canvas of Jane's condo complex the night before really hadn't yielded much either. They had learned that no one had seen Jane since Thursday, which backed up the timeline they had already established from the answering machine messages. But frustratingly, none of the neighbors had heard or seen anything strange or out of the ordinary on that Thursday night. And according to everyone they spoke to, Jane didn't have any obvious feuds or tension with anybody in the community. She generally kept to herself, but she was really well liked by everyone who knew her. But Salado, remembering the scene he had just witnessed, felt sure that someone out there had to have had a major problem with Jane. He had seen the preliminary autopsy report that morning, and it confirmed what he already suspected. Jane had died from the blunt force trauma wounds to her head. But it also told him something else. She had been hit more than a dozen times. It was complete and total overkill. And to Soledo, that meant the killer had to have been driven by some kind of intense, overwhelming emotion, like pure rage or maybe even greed. Which was why they were now making this drive out to LA. They were going to speak with Marion, who Soledo felt, based on her intimate relationship with Jane, was the strongest suspect they had. Romance, he knew, could make people do crazy things. And there was something else. Soledo had done some digging into Jane's finances the night before, and he found out that she had a life insurance policy worth $100,000. And Marion Reese was listed as the sole beneficiary. That meant Marion definitely had something to gain financially from Jane's death. So, as they pulled up to Marion's house, Soledo was thinking that maybe, just maybe, they had found their killer. A few minutes later, the detective sat on a couch in Marion Reese's living room. The home was on the smaller side, especially by LA standards, but it was very tastefully decorated. Marion sat down in an armchair across from them. When they looked at her, they could see her eyes were red and puffy, as if she had been crying for hours. She was holding a glass of water in her hand, and she kept lifting it up as if she was going to take a sip, but then she would just place it back down on the end table without drinking. It was like she was in a daze, just going through the motions. It was clear that someone, likely Mary or Karen, had already told Marion about Jane's death. And to Soledo, she was showing every sign of being in genuine, profound shock. He knew he had to be very careful with his line of questioning. He didn't want to overwhelm her. If she shut down completely, he might not get the information he so desperately needed. After a moment of silence, Soledo began by simply asking Marion how she knew Jane. Marion took a deep, shaky breath, and then, with a wavering voice, she explained that they had known each other for almost 50 years. She told them how they used to work together, how Jane had produced so many projects for her production company. As Marion continued to talk, describing how their professional relationship had slowly transitioned into a deep and loving romance, Soledo could sense that she was beginning to calm down a little. She was calming down to the point where he felt like he could now introduce the tougher questions. So he turned and gave a slight nod to Sutton. At that point, Sutton leaned forward and asked Marion if she was aware that Jane had named her as the sole beneficiary on her life insurance policy. When Marion heard the question, she gasped. She looked completely taken aback. She insisted she had no idea Jane had done that. But, she added, it did sort of make sense. She explained that Jane really didn't have any family to speak of, and that in many ways she, Marion, was her family. She was the closest relationship Jane had in the world. Now, Soledo felt like Marion's reaction to this news was very earnest, very genuine, but he couldn't be 100% sure. So he pressed her a little more. He asked her where she was last Thursday night, the night they presumed Jane was killed. But Marion didn't hesitate. She said she was with friends all night right there in LA. And she gave Soledo all the names and phone numbers of these friends so he and his partner could confirm her story. They talked for a while longer. Marion went over the details of how Jane had missed their opera date on Friday, and then how she had stopped returning her frantic calls. Her entire story lined up perfectly with what Jane's friend Mary had already told them. So eventually, Soledo and Sutton thanked her for her time and stood up to leave. Over an hour later, Detectives Soledo and Sutton were back in Laguna Niguel, parking their cruiser in front of Jane's condo once again. On their drive back from Marion's house in LA, the detectives had made some calls. They had spoken to several of Marion's friends, the ones she had given them the numbers for. And every single one of them confirmed her alibi. On the night Jane was killed, Marion was with them and she was in Los Angeles. And so now, Soledo had to admit that Marion was looking less and less like a viable suspect. So the detectives were back at Jane's condo to look into another working theory they had about what might have happened here. They were considering the possibility that Jane's murder was a hate crime. Remember, this was back in 2004, a time when being homosexual was not as widely accepted as it is today. And so their theory was that maybe one of Jane's neighbors had seen Marion visiting, or perhaps had heard about their relationship through the grapevine. And maybe they didn't like it. And maybe they had lashed out in a fit of violent prejudice. Strengthening this idea was the fact that it seemed to be common knowledge in the neighborhood that most people left their doors unlocked. It painted a picture of a community that was perhaps too trusting, making it easy for a neighbor with a grudge to slip inside Jane's home. However, Sutton and Salado both knew that actually investigating this theory was going to be extremely challenging. There were 144 houses in this condo complex. Conducting a thorough investigation of every single resident of all of those houses was going to be a monumental task that would take a lot of time and manpower. But at this point, they didn't have any other options. They had to pursue every possible lead. So, the detectives got to work. They went to the first house next to Jane's and knocked on the door. A few hours later, Salado and Sutton returned to the Orange County Sheriff's Department. They had spent most of the afternoon talking to people who lived in Jane's condo complex. And while they hadn't been able to talk to everyone yet, they already had to admit that their hate crime theory was looking more and more like a dead end. Most of the people they spoke to didn't even know Jane was in a relationship at all. Since her girlfriend Marion lived in a different city, they rarely saw her around. And beyond that, there was just nothing that anyone in the neighborhood said that made the detectives think that Jane was being targeted for any particular reason. But a few people had mentioned something interesting. They said that recently there had been a string of burglaries in the complex. This was something that was completely unheard of in a safe, quiet place like Laguna Niguel. Still, there was a huge difference between somebody breaking into a house to steal some stuff and breaking in and bludgeoning someone to death with such brutality. But it was a lead, a new thread to pull on. And that's what Salado was thinking about as he and Sutton walked towards their desks. But before they even got there, Salado had this sudden flash of insight, an epiphany. He just stopped dead in his tracks in the middle of the squad room. He turned to Sutton and said, "Turn around. We have to go back to the evidence room. I think everything we need to solve this case might be in this building with us right now." The following day, Salado and Sutton pulled up in front of a restaurant called the Beach House. The previous afternoon, after his epiphany, Salado had suggested that he and Sutton go back to the evidence room and listen to the tapes from Jane's answering machine one more time. Now, to be clear, they had already listened to the tapes before. But at the time, none of the messages had seemed particularly important or relevant. But now, based on what they had learned over the course of their investigation, they realized that those seemingly insignificant messages might actually tell them a lot. And so Salado and Sutton had spent hours re-listening to the tapes, transcribing them, and then gathering even more evidence to confirm what was on them. And even though they were now pretty sure that all this evidence they were gathering told them exactly who killed Jane, they still needed one more piece to fall into place. They had a book of photographs with them. It was a photo lineup. And they knew for a fact that one of the photographs in that book was of their killer. They just needed somebody in this restaurant to verify it for them. So, as soon as they got inside, they found the manager and explained why they were there. Then they asked him, "Hey, would you mind looking at these photos for us? See if you recognize anyone?" The manager looked a bit alarmed by the request, but he ultimately agreed to help. So they all went into a back room away from the customers. They opened up their book of photos and laid it on a table. The manager leaned over and looked. And almost immediately his finger shot out and he pointed to one of the pictures. And when Salado saw the person the manager was pointing to, he felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He knew they had finally cracked the case. Based on forensic evidence and eventually a full confession, here is what investigators believe happened to Jane Thompson in the early morning hours of the 25th of June, 2004. The killer, dressed in dark clothes and gloves and holding a hammer, stood in the darkness of Jane's backyard, right outside her sliding glass doors. The killer had already been to Jane's house a few times earlier that night. But each time they had approached, they had ultimately lost their nerve and left. Because every time they would get there, they would peek through the glass door and see Jane asleep on the couch in front of the television. And that was a problem. They needed Jane to leave the room. They needed her to go to her bedroom and go to sleep in there, out of the way. But she wasn't moving. But this time, as they stood outside the glass doors, they knew they had to go in. They knew if they didn't do it now, they would never get what they wanted from Jane, even if she was right there on the couch. So, the killer took a deep breath, reached forward, and tried the handle of the back door. It slid right open, just as they had expected. It was unlocked. Once the door was open, the killer stepped inside, very carefully, very quietly, and made their way over to the couch where Jane was sleeping. They just wanted to check to make absolutely sure that she was still asleep. But as the killer was hovering over Jane, looking down at her as she lay on her back on the couch, the unthinkable happened. Jane's eyes opened, and she looked right at them. The killer was so surprised, so utterly terrified of being caught, that they instinctively lifted the hammer they were holding and brought it down on Jane's head with all their strength. When the killer finally stopped and their adrenaline-fueled panic began to subside, they just stared down at Jane's destroyed body in total, numb shock. Then they backed away, and they realized that the hammer, the murder weapon, was dripping blood everywhere. So they grabbed the head of the hammer with their gloved hand to try and stop it from dripping, and then they turned and ran right back out through the sliding door. The killer hurried across the street in the darkness, and as they went, they tossed the hammer into a nearby trash can. And when they finally got to their own home, just steps away, they stripped off their bloody clothes, balled them up, and then tried to decide where to hide them. And as they stood there, trying to figure out what to do, they looked out their bedroom window at the house across the street, the house where they had just killed the one person in their life who had ever given them a second chance. It would turn out that Jane Thompson was murdered by a child. Her 5-year-old neighbor, Sam Nelson. Sam had actually broken into Jane's house more than once. He had been breaking in repeatedly and stealing all sorts of things from her, including her credit cards. And that was what the messages on her answering machine had been about. Jane's credit card company had been calling her back after she had reported a series of fraudulent charges on her account. And one of those charges was from that seafood restaurant, the Beach House, the one the investigators visited with the photo lineup. And the manager, when he looked at the photos, he instantly recognized Sam. Because Sam had been in there just a few days earlier, acting so frantic and strange, the reason Sam was stealing from Jane, and also from other people in the neighborhood, was ultimately because he was trying to keep up with appearances. He was using the stolen credit cards and money to buy food and expensive items that he thought would impress his wealthy classmates. On the night of Jane's murder, Sam claimed he did not go into her house with the intention of killing her. He said he just went in there with the intention of robbing her again. But for whatever reason, when she opened her eyes and saw him standing over her, he just panicked. He hit her once with the hammer. He said the blood went into his mouth, and his mind just went blank. And then, suddenly, he was beating her to death. Sam Nelson was arrested and eventually sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for the murder of Jane Thompson and also for multiple counts of burglary. His earliest eligible parole date is in the year 2027. He will be in his late 30s. Jane's friends and her partner, Marion, were left to grapple with an impossible reality. The kind, forgiving woman they loved had been murdered by a boy she was trying to help, a boy from the very community she had chosen for its safety and warmth. The unlocked doors of Laguna Niguel, once a symbol of trust, now served as a haunting reminder of how quickly a life can be shattered by a darkness hiding in plain sight. Thank you so much for watching. Jane spent her final days believing she had done the right thing by giving a troubled kid a second chance. And maybe that's the cruelest part of this entire story. Her kindness was real. Let me know what you thought about today's episode in the comments. And if you're ready for another true crime story, we have a full playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time, take care. In 1918, the world was deep in the trenches of the First World War. A British soldier named Henry Tandy was stationed in northern France, hunkered down in one of those muddy, grim trenches. By this point in the war, Henry was already a hero. He was a decorated soldier, and he would eventually go on to become the most decorated British private of the entire war. But all of his medals and all of his awards are not what he's really remembered for. What he's remembered for happened on a single day, September 28th of that year. It had been a long, brutal day of fighting. As dusk settled, Henry was propped up on the edge of his trench, just scanning the desolate landscape in front of him. He was looking out towards the German line. It was getting dark, the air was quiet for once, and a light mist was starting to roll in, clinging to the ground. And at some point, through that mist, Henry saw a figure. It was way off in the distance, just a silhouette, and it was walking directly towards him. Instinct took over immediately. Henry raised his rifle to his shoulder, his eye finding the sight. But he didn't pull the trigger. He held his breath. He had to be sure who he was looking at. In the confusion of the battlefield, it could easily be one of their own men, maybe wounded and disoriented, trying to make his way back to the safety of the trench. Firing on a friendly was a soldier's worst nightmare. So Henry just stayed there, perfectly still, his rifle aimed, waiting for the figure to get closer, to emerge from the shifting fog. After a few tense seconds, the shape became clearer. A man walked out of the mist. He was a German soldier. So, it was the enemy. But something was off. The man was badly wounded. He was stumbling, not marching. He wasn't carrying a weapon, and he didn't seem to have any idea that he was walking straight into the sights of an enemy rifle. He just kept plodding forward, lost in his own world of pain and exhaustion. Henry centered the rifle's sight right on the German soldier's heart. It was an easy shot, but he hesitated. His finger hovered over the trigger, but he couldn't bring himself to squeeze it. The man just kept walking, getting closer and closer, until he was only about 30 meters away. And at that point, he stopped. He looked up, and his eyes met Henry's. And in that instant, the German soldier realized his mistake. He understood he was about to die. But instead of panicking, instead of trying to run or dive for cover, he just stood there. He stared right at Henry with a look of resignation, as if he was simply accepting his fate. Now, Henry Tandy had shot many men during the war. It was part of the job. It was what you had to do to survive. But this was different. He just could not bring himself to shoot this unarmed, wounded man who just looked so pathetic and defeated. So, with his rifle still raised, Henry quickly glanced to his left and then to his right. He was checking to make sure none of his comrades were watching, that no one was going to see what he was about to do. The coast was clear. And so, Henry slowly, deliberately lowered his gun. For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other across that small patch of no man's land. An enemy soldier who should be dead, and the man who should have killed him. Finally, the German soldier gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of thanks. Then he turned around and just wandered back the way he came, disappearing once again into the mist. The man whose life Henry had just spared was Adolf Hitler. In the early morning hours of the 10th of June, 1994, a woman named Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California. They had planned to be there for a few more days, enjoying their visit. But as Deborah sat up in bed in the dark, she was hit with this sudden, overwhelming urge. She felt like she needed to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. She had no idea where this feeling was coming from. It wasn't a thought, it was a physical sensation, a deep sense of urgency that she couldn't explain. She didn't know what to make of it, so she shook her husband awake. She tried to explain the feeling to him, this strange dread, this feeling that something was wrong, and they had to go home immediately. Her husband, still half asleep, listened patiently. He told her, "You know what? You probably just had a bad dream. You're still kind of waking up, half in your dream. It's not a big deal, just try to go back to bed. Everything is totally fine. He said if she still felt that way in the morning, they could leave then, he would be happy to go. And so, Deborah thought, yeah, he's probably right. I'm totally overreacting. It must have just been a nightmare. She laid back down and closed her eyes, trying to force herself to go back to sleep. But as she laid there in the quiet room, that sense of dread didn't go away. In fact, it just grew stronger and stronger. The feeling that something was terribly wrong and that she had to leave right now was becoming unbearable. It was like an alarm was going off inside her head. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She jumped out of the bed and stood there in the dark. She said to her husband, "Honey, we have to go. Right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we have to go." Her husband really did not want to get up and drive in the middle of the night. He tried to reason with her again. He said, "Come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal." But she was adamant. She wasn't asking any more. She was telling him, "Get out of bed. We are leaving right now." Seeing how serious and genuinely distressed she was, her husband begrudgingly gave in. He said, okay, we'll leave right now. So the two of them hastily packed up their things, trying to be as quiet as possible. They went downstairs and left a quick note for their relatives, trying to explain their sudden departure. Then they got in their car, pulled out of the driveway, and drove off into the night. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey home. It was a stretch of road called Bullion Bend. It was a winding, treacherous road carved into the side of the mountains. There were sharp turns and steep drop-offs. One wrong move, one moment of lost concentration, and you and your car would go flying down the side of a mountain. They were driving through this area for about 15 minutes, the headlights cutting through the darkness when they came around a particularly sharp turn. As soon as they made the turn and could see the stretch of road ahead, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, saw something. Up ahead, on the right side of the road, several feet off the pavement, there was a shape just lying there on the shoulder. At first, she couldn't make it out. She thought maybe it was a large bag of trash that had fallen off a truck, or maybe a dead animal like a deer. Her first instinct was to just dismiss it, to not think about it. But as her husband drove closer and closer, the car's headlights began to illuminate it more clearly. She squinted, trying to discern what it was, but it was just a strange lump. It wasn't until they were right next to it and she looked out her window that she realized what she was seeing. It was a woman's body. A woman with no clothes on, just lying there on the dirt, completely motionless. Deborah gasped and immediately turned to her husband. She screamed, "Honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road." Her husband, hearing the panic in her voice, was instantly on high alert. He didn't slow down, he just kept driving, his mind racing. He said, "Should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her." But Deborah, at this point, was absolutely terrified. She was shaking. She said, "No. Keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there to lure people in. They're going to attack us if we try to stop and help." In that chaotic, frenzied moment with adrenaline pumping, they had to make a decision. They decided their best and safest course of action was to just keep driving until they could find a payphone and call the police. And as it happened, less than a quarter of a mile down the road, there was a ranger station with a phone outside. They pulled into the parking lot, and Deborah jumped out and called the police, her hands trembling as she dialed. The dispatcher told her to wait inside her car with the doors locked, and that officers would be there in a couple of minutes. They said they would need her to lead them back to where she saw the body. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up. Deborah and her husband explained what they saw. The officers told them to drive back up the road, but to stop about 200 yards short of where they thought the body was. So Deborah and her husband got back in their car and drove back up the winding road they had just come down. They reached the point just before that very sharp turn. Deborah knew that right on the other side of that bend was where the body would be. They pulled over on the side of the road as instructed. The police pulled up alongside them. Deborah told them, "Yep, right around that corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side." So Deborah and her husband just sat there in their car, watching as the two officers got out and walked up the road. They saw them make the turn and disappear out of sight. A moment later, they could see the beams of the officers' flashlights moving around on the other side of the bend, sweeping across the dark mountainside. They figured, okay, they're looking for the body now. They must have found her. But after several long minutes, the officers walked back down the road toward their car. One of them tapped on Deborah's window. He said, "You know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary at all." Deborah was stunned. She insisted, "I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body, right there. I know it was. It's right over there." The officers were calm. They told her that they believed she saw something, but they couldn't do anything because there was simply nothing there now. They suggested she and her husband just head home and try to get some rest. And so, confused and shaken, that's what they did. After Deborah and her husband took off, the two responding officers drove back to their station. Once they were inside, they started talking about the strange call. They were speculating about what Deborah might have seen. Maybe it was a mannequin or a trick of the light. As they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser. He overheard their conversation and was intrigued. He walked over and asked them what had happened. They explained the whole story to him about the woman named Deborah who called in a dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. As soon as Rich heard the words Bullion Bend, something clicked in his memory. He remembered that just a couple of days ago, the station had received a missing person report. It was for a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son, Nick. They had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. Rich started to wonder if maybe there was a connection. Maybe there really was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. So, the next morning, Rich got up early and headed out to Bullion Bend by himself. He drove up the mountain road to the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen the body. He parked his car and got out. As he was scanning the area, his eyes landed on something small on the shoulder of the road. It was a children's shoe. He walked over and picked it up. He looked around for anything else that might be out of the ordinary, but there was nothing. No skid marks on the road, no other debris, no other clothes, nothing to indicate an accident. So Rich walked over to the guardrail that overlooked a very steep, densely wooded embankment. He peered over the edge, looking down the side of the mountain. At first, all he could see was a thick canopy of trees and brush. But as he kept looking, scanning back and forth, he thought he saw a flash of color farther down the mountain. It looked like more clothing, snagged on a branch. So, he made a decision. He climbed over the guardrail and very carefully started to make his way down the steep, unstable slope. After just a few seconds of climbing down, he reached a small clearing in the branches. And from there, he could see down to where the terrain leveled off a bit. And right down there, half hidden by the trees, was a smashed-up red four-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she and her son went missing. Rich scrambled the rest of the way down the mountain, following a trail of debris that led all the way to the wrecked car. He went around to the driver's side and looked inside. And there, in the driver's seat, was Christine Skubish. She was deceased. Then he looked over to the passenger seat. There was her son, Nicky, and he was alive. But just barely. He was severely dehydrated and weak. He had gone 5 days without any food or water. Doctors would later say that when Rich found him, Nicky probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours left before he would have died as well. Authorities believe that Christine had probably fallen asleep at the wheel and her car had drifted off the road and plunged down that embankment. Initially, Rich and the other officers believed that Deborah must have seen Christine. The theory was that after the accident, Christine must have somehow survived the initial crash, gotten out of her car, and managed to climb all the way back up that steep embankment. Then she would have laid on the road hoping someone would see her and stop to help. And then, when no one stopped, she must have gone back down to her car, where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner's report, that would have been completely impossible. The coroner determined that when Christine's car crashed, she died on impact. She had been dead for 5 days before Deborah drove by and saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of that road. But it is an objective, undeniable fact that Officer Rich Strasser only went back to investigate Bullion Bend and only found Nikki alive because of Deborah's police report about seeing a dead woman. And Deborah was only on that road in the first place because she had this totally bizarre, unexplainable, middle-of-the-night urge to suddenly leave her relative's house and drive up into the mountains. It was something she had never felt before and still doesn't know how to explain. So either this is one of the most extremely strange sets of coincidences in history, or little Nicky had a guardian angel looking out for him that night. In early 1983, residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment complex in North London started to complain about their drains. They were clogged up and water was backing up into their flats. Initially, their landlord was pretty dismissive. He told them, "Oh, it's just an old building. It's old plumbing, that's why it's slow." But the complaints kept coming, and eventually the landlord conceded and said he would call a plumber to come out and have a look. So, on the evening of February 8th, an experienced plumber named Mike showed up at Cranley Gardens. After hearing what the complaints were, he went around to the side of the building and located a main drain cover. He opened it up to have a look inside. Just as he expected, when he shined his flashlight down into the pipe, he saw big wads of hair and napkins and all sorts of other gunk mashed together, clogging up the works. So he reached in with his gloved hands and started pulling the stuff out, tossing it into a bucket next to him. After he had cleared out the majority of the obstruction, he reached his arm all the way into the pipe to feel around just to make sure he got everything, that there wasn't anything else in there that he couldn't see. At some point, as he was reaching deeper, when his arm was almost completely inside this pipe, his hand hit a major blockage. It was solid. He moved his fingers around, trying to feel what it was, but he couldn't tell. It was something that felt fairly soft, kind of fleshy, but there were some hard things inside of it, like little sticks or rods. So he grabbed a handful of this blockage and he pulled his arm back out of the pipe. He opened his hand to see what he was holding. It looked like ground meat, but it wasn't any kind of meat he had ever seen before. And mixed into this fleshy substance were what looked like little bits of bone. Now, Mike had cleared a lot of pipes in his career, and he had never, ever seen meat be the reason for a blockage. The whole situation just seemed really strange to him. He decided, you know what, it's getting late. I'll just come back tomorrow with my supervisor. He can see what this is too. So Mike put the cap back on the drain pipe and walked out from behind the building, heading back towards his truck, which was parked on the road. As he was walking, 2 of the residents from the complex came out. They saw him and asked, "Hey, did you fix the blockage?" What was it? And Mike said, no, he hadn't fixed it yet. And then he just kind of blurted out that there was meat in the pipes. That's what was causing the blockage. And then one of these 2 residents, a man, casually says, "Well, I bet people are just flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the drains. That's what's causing it." Mike just looked at him and was like, "Yeah, maybe." Then he turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. Early the next morning, Mike and his supervisor came back to Cranley Gardens. They went around to the side of the building, they took the cap off the drain, and then Mike reached down inside, expecting to feel that same strange, meaty blockage. But where it should have been, there was nothing. The pipe was clear. Somebody had come and cleared it out overnight. Mike and his supervisor are looking at each other, and Mike is like, there's no way that cleared on its own. Someone had to have come out here and done it. He couldn't understand why someone would do that, but still have them come back out. But the men decide, you know what? Maybe by some slim chance, it did just slip through and clear itself. So they decided to just continue the process and make sure each apartment building's individual pipe was unobstructed. They started checking the pipes one by one, and they found that all of them were clear, except for one. The pipe coming from apartment number 23 was completely blocked up with more of that same meaty substance. Now, Mike and his partner were already very suspicious. The fact that someone had probably snuck out in the middle of the night and cleared the main pipe was a huge red flag. And now they're finding more of this weird fleshy stuff, and it's coming from one specific apartment. The whole situation just felt wrong. So they told the landlord that they were not going to touch it. Somebody else had to come out and deal with this. The landlord, after finding out there was what looked like meat jammed in his pipes, got really freaked out and he called the police. The police showed up, they pulled the meaty substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary for analysis. A pathologist looked at it and confirmed their worst fears. This was meat, all right? It was human meat. And in particular, the stuff that was pulled out of the pipe from apartment number 23 was identified as being from a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens. They go up to apartment number 23 and they knock on the door. When the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelming stench of rotting flesh. It was nauseating. And standing in the doorway of this apartment is a guy in his late 30s or early 40s who introduces himself as Dennis Nilsson. The police say, "Hey, Dennis, can we have a look around your apartment?" And he says, "You know, why? What's this about?" They tell him, "Well, we found human remains in your pipes." And Dennis immediately puts on a show of shock and horror. He says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's horrible." But the police are not buying it for a second. One of the officers looks him straight in the eye and says, "You know what, Dennis? Tell us where the rest of the body is." And at this, Dennis's whole demeanor changed. His face suddenly went blank, expressionless. All the emotion just drained away. He just turns around, points into his bedroom, and says in a flat voice, "It's in 2 plastic bags in my closet." Before the police go into his apartment to inspect the bags, they ask him, "Dennis, are there any other bodies in your apartment that we should know about?" Dennis sighs and he looks up at the ceiling for a moment as if he's counting. And then he says, "Yeah, there's about 15 or 16 here." It's a long story. It goes way back. I'd love to tell it to you, get this off my chest. And I'll do it at the police station. After Dennis was arrested and brought to the station, he told them his entire horrible story. It had all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33 years old. He was at a pub having some drinks by himself when a teenager came into the bar and tried to buy an alcoholic drink. He was denied service because he was underage. So Dennis saw an opportunity. He pulled the young man aside and said, "Hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's just right down the road." The young man, whose name was Steven, was excited about this and said, "Great, let's go." Once they got back to Dennis's apartment, the two of them had lots of drinks. They were having fun, laughing, and at some point they climbed into bed together. The next morning, when Dennis got up, his new friend Steven was still sleeping right next to him. And as Dennis looked at him, he was filled with this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. Because he knew that as soon as Steven woke up, he would see this as just a one-night stand. He would get dressed, and he would leave. He wouldn't stick around and remain friends with Dennis. And Dennis just could not stand that idea. He wanted Steven to stay. He looked on the ground next to the bed and saw the necktie that Steven had been wearing. It was just lying there in a heap. He got on the ground, he grabbed the necktie, and he fashioned it into a noose. Then he climbed back on the bed, got on top of Stephen's chest, and he looped the tie around his neck. Then he pulled it as tight as he could. Dennis would tell police that as soon as the tie tightened, Stephen came alive. He started thrashing, reaching for his neck, trying to pull the tie off, kicking Dennis as hard as he could, but he just couldn't get it off. And at some point, Dennis said, Stephen just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis, and he knew he wasn't going to win this fight, that Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Stephen just allowed himself to go limp. Dennis said he relaxed the pressure a little bit, but as he's looking at Stephen, he realized he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. So Dennis goes into his kitchen and he gets this huge plastic bucket. He fills it up with water and sets it in the middle of his kitchen floor. Then he gets a bunch of kitchen chairs and he lines them up like he's making a makeshift table right in front of this bucket of water. Then he drags Stephen's unconscious body into the kitchen and he lays him on his back across these chairs. But he makes sure his head is not resting on a chair, his head is kind of dangling off the back. Then he grabbed that bucket of water and he slid it right underneath Stephen's dangling head. Then Dennis got on top of the chairs on top of Stephen and he pressed the young man's face straight down, bending his head backwards until his mouth and his nose were under the water. Dennis held him like that. Stephen regained consciousness for a moment, submerged in the water, but again, he didn't fight it. He knew he was doomed. After several minutes, the bubbles stopped coming to the surface, and Stephen was dead. Dennis pulled his victim's body off of the chairs. He brought him into the living room, and he sat him up on a chair. Then Dennis went into the kitchen, and he made himself a cup of coffee and smoked a few cigarettes. And he just stood in the doorway and looked at Stephen's body sitting there in the chair. He would tell police it was a very bizarre experience because Stephen still looked like he was alive. In fact, Dennis started talking to him as if he expected him to talk back. But obviously, he didn't. At some point, Dennis realized that the life he had before he killed Stephen was now over. He had a new life now, and he didn't really know how to handle it. The first thing he thought to do was to clean Stephen. So he took Stephen's body and brought him into the bathroom, and he gave him a very long bath. He cleaned his body, he washed his hair, and afterwards he got him out, he dried him off, dressed him, and put him into his own bed. And then Dennis climbed into bed with him and just laid there. He would tell police that as he laid there, he suddenly felt overjoyed. Stephen was not going to leave him. He was going to stay here for as long as Dennis wanted him to. After laying with the body for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Stephen's body in his apartment so no one could find him. He left his apartment and went to a hardware store where he bought an electric knife and a big storage bin. He brought them back to his apartment, and as he was about to start cutting Stephen up, he just couldn't go through with it. So instead, he just climbed back into bed and took a nap next to Stephen's body. When he got up again, he moved Stephen's body onto the ground in his living room and covered him with a blanket. Then he went and made dinner, sat in his chair right next to the body on the ground, and watched television for a while. When he was done watching TV, he looked at the body on the floor and realized he really hadn't made any progress in terms of hiding him. And that's when he remembered that he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. He went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up, and he saw there was a crawl space under the floors. So he pulled a couple more boards up, and then he grabbed Stephen's body and attempted to force him down into the space. But by now, Stephen's body had begun to stiffen up from rigor mortis. Specifically, his arms were outstretched over his head in a kind of Y shape. So as Dennis was trying to force him down into the narrow space, his rigid arms were getting in the way. So Dennis took Stephen's body and he propped him up against the wall in his bedroom. The body was just standing there, rigid against the wall, with its arms stuck up over its head and its eyes still open. And then, after doing that, Dennis just got into his bed and fell asleep. So, all night long, this corpse is essentially staring at Dennis from across the room. The next morning, when Dennis got up, there was Stephen, still propped against the wall, hands in the air, looking down at him. Dennis grabbed Stephen's body, put it on the ground, and began yanking and jerking and pulling on each of Stephen's arms until he finally broke the rigor mortis and could pin them down by his side. Then he started working on his legs and his hips, contorting the body until it was small enough that he could pack him down under the floor. Once he was under there, Dennis just put the boards back on top and went about his daily life. For the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Stephen. But about a week after putting him under the floor, Dennis decided he missed Stephen and he wanted to see him again. So one night, he opened up the floorboards, he looked down, and there was Stephen. Dennis would say it looked like he was dirty. So he pulled him out of the floor and he gave him another bath. After he had cleaned Stephen's body, he pulled him out of the water, dried him off, and put him back in the chair. And then Dennis took a bath himself in the same water he had just used to clean the corpse. After a long soak, Dennis finally got out, toweled himself off, he redressed Stephen, and then he forced him back under the floorboards and covered him up again. The body would remain there for the next 7 months. Finally, Dennis decided to dispose of him by burning him in a bonfire outside of the apartment building. After the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking to himself, "I can't believe I just got away with murder." And so, he would do it again. And again, and again. He killed at least 15 young men from North London, all by strangulation, or by drowning, or a combination of the two. And after he killed them, he would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time. In his closet, in his cabinets, in his bed, under the floors. His small apartment was filled with these bodies. And while they were in his apartment, he liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them. He told police he found corpses to be beautiful. He was fascinated by them. But eventually, in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. And so he began cutting them up into smaller pieces and trying to force them down his toilet and his drain, which eventually clogged the pipes for the whole building. And so when Mike, the plumber, showed up and discovered the me-substance, Dennis overheard him talking about it. That night, after Mike was gone, Dennis had gone outside and attempted to clear the rest of the human remains from the main pipes, but he wasn't aware that there were still remains stuck in the specific pipe that led directly to his apartment. Dennis Nilsen confessed to killing 15 young men and attempting to kill at least 7 others. He was sentenced to life in prison. Dennis never showed any remorse, nor did he ever show any desire to want to be free again. He actually said that he deserved to be in jail for what he did. In 2018, Dennis Nilsen would die in prison at the age of 72. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Hundreds of people survived the crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. But in the years that followed, some of those survivors, along with pilots, flight attendants, and even airline executives, would claim they kept seeing members of the dead crew still walking the halls of the aircraft. And the strangest part? The sightings only happened on planes built with salvaged parts from the wreckage. This is the story of Flight 401. Around 8:30 inches the evening on the 29th of December 1972, the sprawling terminals of JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, were buzzing with the usual holiday travel chaos. Amidst the noise, an announcement echoed through the terminal. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami, Florida was now boarding. Over the next half hour, 176 people, including 13 crew members, boarded the massive aircraft. Once everyone was seated, the crew began their final preparations for takeoff, a routine they had performed countless times before. But Flight 401 was no ordinary plane. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, one of the newest and most advanced passenger jets in the world at the time. It was enormous, capable of carrying hundreds of passengers, with a cabin so wide it had 8 seats across each row. To many travelers, stepping inside felt less like boarding an airplane and more like entering a flying hotel. The L-1011 was also designed unlike almost anything passengers had seen before. Beneath the main passenger cabin was an entire lower level accessible only by two tiny crew elevators near the back of the aircraft. Down there was a massive galley kitchen filled with ovens and refrigerators, along with a private lounge where crew members could rest during long flights. The lower deck felt strangely isolated from the rest of the plane, almost like a separate world hidden beneath the passengers above. And the man responsible for guiding this massive aircraft through the night was Captain Bob Loft. He was 55 years old, a veteran pilot who looked every bit the part of a classic airline captain. He had a commanding presence and was known for his striking good looks. But more importantly, he had an incredible amount of experience with over 30,000 hours logged in the air. For anyone unfamiliar with aviation, that is a staggering amount of time. To his colleagues, Captain Bob was known as a perfectionist. He was calm, confident, and had a reputation for staying composed under pressure. He was exactly the kind of person you'd want flying your plane. The man in charge of this magnificent machine that night was Captain Bob Loft. He was 55 years old, a veteran pilot who looked every bit the part of a classic airline captain. He had a commanding presence and was known for his striking good looks. But more importantly, he had an incredible amount of experience with over 30,000 hours logged in the air. For anyone unfamiliar with aviation, that is a staggering amount of time. To his colleagues, Captain Bob was known as a perfectionist. He was a man who exuded a calm confidence and had a reputation for being cool and collected, especially under pressure. He was exactly the kind of person you'd want flying your plane. After Captain Bob boarded the aircraft, he walked directly to the front of the plane and entered the cockpit. He settled into the captain's seat, the one on the front left, a position he had occupied for much of his professional life. A few moments later, he was joined by his first officer or co-pilot, a man named Bert Stockdale. Bert was 10 years younger than Bob, but was also a very experienced aviator. He came into the cockpit, greeted his captain, and sat down in the co-pilot's seat, which was directly to the right of Captain Bob. With the pilot and co-pilot in place, the other two members of the cockpit crew for that evening made their way in. Now, on most passenger jets of that era, the cockpit was a two-person operation. But the L-1011 was so large and complex that it required a four-person crew up front. One of these men was the 51-year-old flight engineer, Don Repo. Don was a big man, physically imposing, but his personality was the complete opposite. He was known for being gentle, soft-spoken, and very approachable, a guy everyone felt comfortable talking to. Don entered the cockpit, exchanged hellos with the pilots, and took his seat, which was situated right behind the co-pilot, Bert. Seconds after Don sat down, the final man entered the cockpit. He was 47-year-old Angelo Donato. Angelo wasn't actually a member of the flight crew for this specific journey. He was, however, an employee of Eastern Airlines, a maintenance specialist who needed to get to Miami for work. As a company courtesy, he was given a ride on Flight 401. His seat was the fourth and final one in the cockpit, right behind Captain Bob. With the four men settled in, the cockpit door was secured. By about 9:10 p.m., all the pre-flight checks had been meticulously completed. Every system was checked, every dial was monitored, and everything was confirmed to be in perfect working order. All the passengers were in their seats with their belts fastened, and the rest of the crew was in position. Captain Bob Loft communicated with the control tower, got his clearance, and began to taxi the giant L-1011 away from the gate and towards the runway. 10 minutes later, at precisely 9:20 p.m., the plane was lined up. Captain Bob pushed the throttles forward, and the massive engines roared to life. The plane accelerated down the runway, and within moments, Flight 401 lifted off the ground, climbing into the dark winter sky over New York, turning south on its course to Miami. For the next 2 hours, the flight was perfectly, almost boringly, normal. It was exactly what you would want from a cross-country flight. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with their carts, serving drinks and snacks. Passengers settled in, some reading books, others chatting quietly, and many just dozing off. The journey was so smooth and unremarkable that one of the passengers, a man named Jerry Escow, felt compelled to write a letter. He pulled out a pen and some paper and began to write a note to Eastern Airlines, complimenting them on their excellent service and remarking on how wonderfully smooth this particular flight was. His intention was to mail the letter to the airline's headquarters as soon as they landed in Miami. But then, at 11:32 p.m., 2 hours and 12 minutes after a flawless takeoff, the routine nature of Flight 401 came to an abrupt end. The flight was about to transform from a simple trip to Miami into a story that would be told for decades to come. At that moment, Captain Bob began the plane's initial descent and approach towards Miami International Airport. It was a standard procedure, but as he lowered the plane's landing gear, his co-pilot, Bert Stockdale, noticed a problem. An L-1011 jet, like the one they were flying, has 3 sets of landing gear. There are the main wheels that descend from under the left wing, another set that comes down from under the right wing, and a third set that deploys from the nose of the plane. Inside the cockpit, there's a small panel with indicator lights corresponding to each of these sets of gear. When a piece of landing gear successfully extends and locks into place, ready for landing, a small green light bulb on this panel illuminates. It's a simple, foolproof system. But when Captain Bob lowered the gear, Bert noticed that only 2 of the 3 green lights came on. The light for the nose landing gear remained dark. Now, in the minds of Captain Bob and the other experienced men in that cockpit, the first assumption was not that the landing gear itself had failed. This was a brand new, technologically advanced airplane. It had just been inspected before leaving New York. The odds of a mechanical failure with the actual landing gear were incredibly slim. The far more likely culprit, they all believed, was the little green light bulb itself. It had probably just burned out. So, Captain Bob, while continuing his approach towards Miami, decided to cycle the gear. He retracted all the landing gear back into the plane, waited a moment, and then lowered it all again. The thought was that this would reset the system and hopefully the light would come on. But when the gear deployed for the second time, the result was the same. The 2 main gear lights were green, but the nose gear light was still stubbornly dark. Frustrated, Captain Bob knew he couldn't proceed with the landing. You don't land a plane of that size without absolute confirmation that all your landing gear is locked in place. He got on the radio and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control. He calmly explained the situation, telling them that he had an issue with his landing gear indicator and couldn't confirm that it was safe to land. He requested permission to break off his approach and circle around for a while to give them time to figure it out. The air traffic controller in Miami acknowledged Captain Bob's message. He directed the captain to fly west, out over the nearby Everglades, a massive and unpopulated wetlands area in southern Florida. The controller told him to hold a circling pattern out there, away from the other air traffic, until they had sorted out their problem. And so, Flight 401 veered away from the bright lights of Miami and headed out over the pitch-black darkness of the Everglades. Once they were in their designated holding pattern, Captain Bob and his co-pilot set the plane to autopilot. They programmed it to maintain a constant altitude of 2,000 feet and a steady speed of 200 miles per hour. With the plane flying itself, the crew could now focus their full attention on the real problem, that pesky little light bulb. Once the autopilot was engaged, Captain Bob and his co-pilot Bert began to physically troubleshoot the nose gear indicator light. They were still convinced the problem was the bulb, not the gear. Their first attempt was simple. They just started pressing on the light, hoping a loose connection was the issue. When that didn't work, they tried twisting the bulb assembly in its socket. That didn't work either. Growing more annoyed, they decided to pull the light bulb completely out of the panel. They managed to get it out, and Bob blew on it, as if trying to clear away some unseen dust or grime. Then they tried to jam it back into the panel, but in their haste, not only did the light not come on, they realized they had put it back in sideways. It was now wedged in the panel at an odd angle, and they couldn't get it back out. Now they had a new problem. The light definitely wasn't going to come on, and they still needed to find a way to visually confirm that the nose landing gear was down. At this point, Captain Bob's frustration was boiling over. He turned around in his seat and looked at Don Repo, the flight engineer, who was sitting right behind the co-pilot. He told Don to go down into the hellhole and take a direct look at the front landing gear himself. The hellhole, as it was called, was a small maintenance space located directly beneath the cockpit floor. Access was through a trap door in the center of the cockpit. Once you were down in that cramped space, there was a small viewport, a window that looked directly forward towards the front of the aircraft. From there, you could get a clear, unobstructed view of the nose landing gear assembly and see with your own eyes if it was down and locked. And so, Don Repo unbuckled his seatbelt, got out of his seat, lifted open the hellhole's trap door, and began to make his way down into the compartment below. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet below the troubled flight, a 43-year-old man named Robert Maris was out in the Everglades with a friend. They were on Robert's airboat, gliding through the dark waters looking for frogs. An airboat is a unique vessel, a flat-bottomed boat propelled by a giant fan on the back. They're perfect for the Everglades, where the water can be incredibly shallow, sometimes only a few inches deep. For these two men, the world around them was one of absolute, total blackness. There were no city lights, no buildings, no signs of human life for miles and miles in every direction. The only light they had was the one from Robert's headlamp. At some point, Robert cut the engine of the airboat, and the two friends stood there in the sudden silence, scanning the dark marsh around them. The night was alive with the sounds of the swamp, the low growl of alligators, the slithering of snakes in the tall grass, and the chorus of frogs. They were just standing there, listening, when something out of the corner of Robert's eye caught his attention. He looked up, and in that instant, he saw a huge flash of orange and yellow light. It seemed to erupt from the ground about 5 miles away from their position. But just as quickly as it appeared, the flash of light dissipated and it was gone, leaving only the oppressive darkness behind. Robert turned to his friend, who hadn't seen it. Robert pointed in the direction of the flash and said, "Hey, let's go check that out." Let's see what that was. He fired up his boat's powerful engine again, and they sped off across the Everglades, heading straight for the spot where he had seen the mysterious light. After about 15 minutes of racing at 40 miles per hour across the dark expanse of water and sawgrass, they finally reached the area where the flash had occurred. And when they got there, Robert and his friend could not believe what they were looking at. About 20 minutes earlier, back up inside the cockpit of Flight 401, a small, seemingly insignificant action had set in motion a catastrophic chain of events. When Captain Bob turned around in his seat to talk to the flight engineer Don Repo and tell him to go down into the hellhole, it's believed that his leg or knee inadvertently nudged the plane's steering column, also known as the yoke. This small, accidental bump was just enough to disengage the L-1011's autopilot. The plane was no longer holding its altitude of 2,000 feet. It had entered a very slow, very gradual descent. And tragically, nobody in the cockpit noticed. There were a few reasons for this. First, it was completely pitch black outside. They were flying over the unlit Everglades, and there was no moon that night. Looking out the window would have offered no visual cues, no reference points to indicate that they were losing altitude. It would have just looked like a black void. Second, the descent was so gradual that there was no physical sensation of falling. It wouldn't have felt like they were tumbling out of the sky. It would have felt just like the smooth, level cruising they were expecting. And third, and most critically, all four men in the cockpit were completely and utterly fixated on solving the problem of the landing gear light bulb. Their attention was so tunneled on this one minor issue that they missed a crucial warning. An alarm did actually go off inside the cockpit, a chime designed to alert them that they had dipped below their assigned altitude. But the alarm only sounded once, and it wasn't particularly loud. Amidst their conversation and the focus on their task, the warning went completely unnoticed. And so, not long after Don Repo had disappeared down into the hellhole, the plane, which had been slowly losing altitude all this time, crashed into the Everglades. The impact was a complete and total surprise. No one on board, Flight 401, not the crew in the cockpit, not the flight attendants in the cabin, and certainly not the passengers, had any idea they were in danger until the very last second when they hit the ground. When the massive plane struck the swamp, it disintegrated and exploded in a massive fireball. That was the huge orange and yellow flash that Robert Maris had seen from 5 miles away. So Robert and his friends sped their airboat over to the crash site, and when they arrived, they were the first people on the scene. It was a scene of utter devastation. They could hear the sounds of people screaming, crying, and moaning all around them in the darkness, but they couldn't see anything. The intense fire from the initial explosion had been almost instantly extinguished by the swampy, wet ground. Even though the plane had slammed into the ground at over 200 miles per hour, the angle of impact had been relatively shallow. Because the plane was in that slow, gradual descent, it had more or less coasted into the ground rather than diving straight down. That fact, combined with the soft, muddy terrain of the Everglades, meant that the impact was far less violent than it could have been. And this, miraculously, saved a lot of lives. Dozens of passengers actually survived the initial crash. But many of them were left with horrific injuries, or they were trapped within the mangled wreckage of the plane, or in many cases, both. As Robert and his friend reached the edge of the crash scene, Robert raised his headlamp and began to scan the debris field. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a nightmarish landscape of twisted metal and body parts sticking out of the mud. Then his light fell upon the first survivor he saw. It was a man whose clothes had been completely burned away by the explosion. The only thing he was wearing were the charred remnants of his socks on both ankles. He was still strapped into his airplane seat. When the plane broke apart, his seat had been thrown forward and had landed face down in the mud, pinning the man's upper body and most of his face under several inches of murky water. As Robert's light hit him, the man looked up, his eyes pleading, and he begged Robert and his friend to help him before he drowned. Without a second's hesitation, Robert and his friend jumped off their boat and waded through the jet fuel-slicked water over to the man. They grabbed the heavy airplane seat and pulled it up and out of the water, saving his life. But as soon as they had freed him, they began to hear more calls for help, more desperate screams coming from all around them in the darkness. Robert and his friend worked tirelessly, doing their absolute best to save as many people as they could. But the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. There were simply too many people who needed help and not enough time. About 30 minutes after Robert and his friend had arrived, the first official rescue teams from the Coast Guard showed up in helicopters. They, along with Robert and his friend, would spend the rest of the night pulling survivors from the wreckage and airlifting them to safety. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the grim task was over. There were no other survivors left to be found. In total, 99 people had died in the crash. But, incredibly, 77 people had survived. Among the dead were the men in the cockpit, Captain Bob Loft, his co-pilot Bert Stockdale, and the flight engineer Don Repo, who had gone down into the hellhole to check the landing gear. Among the survivors were Angelo Donato, the fourth man in the cockpit, and, ironically, Jerry Escow, the man who had been writing the letter to Eastern Airlines about what a wonderful flight it had been. A major investigation was launched by the National Transportation Safety Board in the aftermath of the crash. Their final report confirmed that the primary cause of the disaster was human error. The crew's obsession with a burned-out light bulb had led them to neglect their primary duty of flying the plane. The investigation also confirmed what the crew had initially suspected. The nose landing gear had been working perfectly fine the entire time. The indicator light hadn't come on simply because the $10 bulb had burned out. Following the investigation, Eastern Airlines did what it could to make amends. They made every effort to provide compensation to both the survivors of the crash and the families of those who had been killed. The airline also instituted major changes to their pilot training programs and cockpit procedures to ensure that a tragedy like this, caused by such a simple distraction, would never happen again. But this was not the end of the story for Flight 401. For almost 3 years after the crash, a strange and terrifying phenomenon began to unfold among the employees of Eastern Airlines. At first, many of these employees who experienced something unusual would report what happened to their superiors. But it became clear very early on that Eastern Airlines did not want anyone talking about these incidents. Whenever an employee came forward with one of these strange reports, they were often met with skepticism and ridicule. Some were told to see a psychiatrist, and others were simply fired. However, despite this intense pressure from the airline for its employees to remain silent, there were still some very brave people who had first-hand experiences with this phenomenon who refused to be quiet. They still came forward and told their stories to journalists and authors, but they did so anonymously to protect their careers. What follows are two of the most chilling accounts from those employees. It's important to note that the names used in these stories have been changed. In March of 1973, just 3 months after Flight 401 had crashed in the Everglades, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Jenny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working alongside her on this flight was her close friend and fellow flight attendant, a woman named Denise. Neither of these women had been on Flight 401 when it went down. The plane they were assigned to for their flight to Florida was designated as aircraft number 318 by Eastern Airlines. It was an L-1011 TriStar, the same model as Flight 401. In fact, plane number 318 had more in common with Flight 401 than just its model number. It actually had some of the original parts from the crashed plane installed on it. It turned out that during the lengthy investigation of the crash, investigators had recovered numerous parts from the wreckage of Flight 401 that were still in surprisingly good condition. After these parts were rigorously tested and certified to be fully functional, they were salvaged and installed on other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airlines fleet. Now, at the time, this was not considered an unusual or inappropriate practice. These parts were incredibly expensive, they were in perfect working order, and they had played no role in causing the crash of Flight 401. So, from the airline's perspective, it was a perfectly logical and cost-effective thing to do. So, Jenny and Denise, along with the rest of the flight crew, boarded plane number 318 for their flight to Florida. After takeoff, the flight attendants began their routine of preparing and serving food and drinks to the nearly 200 passengers on board. It was a long and involved process on a plane of that size. The flight attendants had a system to divide the work. Some of them would stay on the main upper level of the plane, moving through the cabin to take orders from all the passengers. The other flight attendants would be down on the lower level in the large galley kitchen, preparing all the food and drinks to be sent up. At some point during the service, Denise, who was working on the main level taking orders, found herself with a moment of downtime. She had taken all the orders in her section and decided to head down to the lower level to see if her friend Jenny, who was working in the kitchen, needed any help. But, in a strange twist of timing, just as Denise was getting into one of these small elevators at the back of the plane to go down, Jenny, who was on the lower level, also found herself with nothing to do. She had already prepared her service cart and was about to go up to the main level to see if Denise needed a hand. Jenny got into the other elevator and started going up. The two women in their separate elevator cars literally passed each other between the two decks, completely unaware of each other's presence. When Jenny arrived on the main level, she got off the elevator, walked down the aisle, and started asking the other flight attendants if they had seen Denise. They told her, "Oh, you just missed her. She went down to the kitchen to see you just a minute ago." So, after a couple of minutes of confirming Denise wasn't on the upper deck, Jenny decided to go back down to the lower level to find her. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to picture the layout of that lower level. When you came down in either of the two elevators, the doors would open to a view down a long hallway that stretched from the back of the plane towards the front. Stepping out of the elevator placed you right in the middle of the kitchen. It was a very cramped space. On the left side was a long counter with a row of ovens stacked against the wall. On the right side was a row of cabinets and cupboards for storage. If you were to walk straight from the kitchen towards the front of the plane, you would come to a wall that separated the kitchen from the crew lounge. On this wall, slightly off to the right, was a door that led into the lounge. So, if you were standing in the kitchen looking towards the front, you couldn't really see into the lounge area because of the door's position. You'd have to physically walk over to the doorway and poke your head through to get a full view of the lounge, which was just a small room with a few sofas and chairs. So, Jenny got back in the elevator and made her way back down to the lower level, still looking for Denise. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped out into the kitchen. Denise was not there. The kitchen was completely empty. The door leading into the lounge area was closed. But the moment Jenny stepped off that elevator, she was overcome with a powerful and undeniable feeling that Denise was definitely down there with her, somewhere on that lower level, probably in the lounge. She felt so certain of this that she didn't even bother to call out Denise's name or walk over to the lounge door to check. Instead, feeling confident Denise would emerge eventually, Jenny just turned to her left, went over to the ovens, and began preparing food trays for the attendants upstairs. As she was arranging the plates, Jenny would periodically glance over at the closed door to the lounge. She kept expecting it to open at any moment and for Denise to walk out. But after a couple of minutes passed, the door remained shut. Jenny started to think to herself, I'm making a fair amount of noise over here. If someone was in the lounge, surely they would have come out by now to see who it was. And because that intense feeling of not being alone down there persisted, a new thought entered her mind. Wait a minute. Is Denise playing a joke on me? Is she hiding in the lounge or maybe in one of these cabinets waiting to jump out and scare me? The moment she had that thought, a wave of paranoia washed over her. Now, as she was trying to work, she was constantly looking over her shoulder at the lounge door or scanning the cabinet doors, fully expecting Denise to burst out at any second. But after several more minutes, nothing happened. The lounge door stayed closed. The cabinet doors remained shut. As far as she could see, she was completely alone down there. And yet, the longer she stayed, the stronger and more unsettling that feeling of a presence became. It got to the point where she couldn't even focus on making the food. She completely turned away from the counter and was just standing in the middle of the kitchen, slowly scanning the empty room, now desperately hoping that Denise would jump out and scare her just to have an explanation for the feeling. When that didn't happen, Jenny decided she had to know for sure. She took a deep breath and began walking slowly towards the door that led into the lounge. By the time she reached it, her heart was pounding in her chest. She reached down, turned the handle, pushed the door open, and quickly poked her head inside. The lounge was empty. There was no one there. But the instant her head was inside that room, the feeling that someone was down there with her spiked dramatically. She got goosebumps all over her body. She ran into the lounge and started looking behind all the chairs and the sofas, praying at this point that she would find Denise hiding there. But after searching every corner of the room, she found nothing. Finally, Jenny turned around, her back to the far wall of the lounge, completely overcome with fear. She was now at the very front of the lower level. There was no one in the lounge. She knew there was no one in the kitchen. But the terrifying sensation that she was not alone was stronger than ever. She knew she had to get back to the elevator, which meant crossing the entire lounge, going through the door, and crossing the kitchen. Almost instinctively, Jenny moved to the left side of the lounge, pressing her back flat against the wall so that she could be certain no one was behind her. Then she began to slowly inch her way along the wall, back towards the open door that led to the kitchen. As she shimmied along, her view of the kitchen got wider and wider. The whole time she was thinking, I'm going to see someone in there. I have to. This feeling isn't going away, but when she finally reached the doorway and stepped back into the kitchen, it was still completely empty. At that point, she made a run for the elevator. She started frantically hitting the call button, constantly looking over her shoulder, feeling that awful sensation that someone was right behind her. Finally, the elevator car arrived. She jumped inside, slammed the door shut, hit the button for the main level, and began her ascent. When the elevator doors opened back on the main level, Jenny practically collided with another flight attendant who was standing right outside, a woman named Mildred. After they both regained their balance, Mildred got a good look at Jenny's face and could see immediately that something was terribly wrong. Jenny was pale, she was sweating, she was shaking. Mildred asked her, Jenny, are you okay? What's going on? Jenny just stammered, I don't know. I can't explain what's going on. I don't know. But Mildred, instead of pressing for details, just took her by the arm and said, Jenny, you need to come with me. Mildred led Jenny to a small crew area behind the elevators, out of view of the passengers. And standing there was Denise. And Denise looked just as bad as Jenny did. She was pale as a ghost, sweating, and looked completely shaken. It turned out that in the few minutes while Jenny had been up on the main level looking for Denise, Denise had been down on the lower level, and Denise's experience had been a mirror image of Jenny's. She said that when she got off the elevator into the kitchen, no one was there. But she immediately had the same powerful sense that Jenny was down there somewhere, a strong feeling that she was not alone. When she opened the door and looked into the empty lounge, it spooked her so badly that she immediately turned around, ran back to the elevator, and went straight back upstairs. And as she was going up in her elevator, she had passed Jenny, who was in the other elevator on her way back down. Once again, they had just missed each other. These two women, who had never experienced anything like this before, had just had nearly identical, terrifying experiences, completely independent of each other, just a few minutes apart, in the exact same location. It was far too much of a coincidence for them to just dismiss it. 1 month later, that same plane, number 318, was sitting at the gate at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey. The flight crew was on board, conducting their pre-flight checks before their morning flight to Miami. After most of the checks were completed, the passengers were allowed to board. Once it seemed like everyone was on and had taken their seats, the senior flight attendant, a woman named Sis, began her final head count to make sure the number of people on the plane matched the manifest. As she walked up and down the aisles, carefully counting each passenger, she realized their count was off by 1. They had 1 person too many. So Sis started her count again, this time more slowly. She quickly found the source of the discrepancy. As she was counting the passengers in the first-class cabin, she noticed a man in an Eastern Airlines captain's uniform sitting in one of the seats. Immediately, Sis thought to herself, okay, I don't recognize him, but he must be deadheading. Deadheading is a common practice in the airline industry where an off-duty employee, like a pilot or flight attendant, will catch a ride on a company flight to get to another airport where they're scheduled to work. In the 1970s, it wasn't uncommon for these employees to just check the flight manifest, see if there was an open seat, and get on board without formally notifying the flight crew beforehand. So, Sis assumed that this was the case with this captain. He was the extra person, and she just needed to get his name to add him to the manifest. Sis walked up the aisle until she was standing right in front of the captain, who was just sitting there staring straight ahead, motionless. Sis introduced herself and politely asked him if he was deadheading. But the captain didn't respond. He didn't even turn his head or seem to acknowledge her presence in any way, even though she was standing right in front of him and speaking very clearly. Sis waited for a moment, a bit confused, and then asked again, a little louder this time, "Excuse me, sir, what's your name? I need to account for you on our flight." But again, the captain just sat there, completely still, without reacting at all. By now, another flight attendant named Diane had noticed the strange interaction and walked over to see what was going on. She watched as Sis tried a third time to get the man's attention, but he still did nothing. Diane and Sis exchanged a puzzled look, unsure of what to do. Finally, Sis said, "Okay, I'm going to go get the captain. He can deal with this." So, Diane stayed in the aisle next to the silent seated man, while Sis walked up to the cockpit to get the flight's actual captain, whose name was George. George came out of the cockpit with Sis, and they walked back down the aisle towards the strange passenger. By the time they got there, several other passengers in the first-class cabin had noticed the commotion and were turned around in their seats, watching this bizarre scene unfold. George, Sis, and Diane were now all standing in the aisle next to the silent captain. George crouched down to get a good look at the man's face, since he was still just looking straight ahead with his hat on, and no one had really seen him clearly. As George knelt down and saw the man's face for the first time, his own face went white with shock. He stumbled backward and gasped, "Oh my God, that's Bob Loft." It was the same Bob Loft who had been the captain of Flight 401 and had died in the crash in the Everglades. George had known Bob well and recognized him instantly. But before anyone, George, Sis, Diane, or the half-dozen passengers who were watching could process what was happening, the seated, silent figure that looked exactly like Captain Bob Loft vanished. He didn't get up and walk away. He just dematerialized into thin air, right in front of their eyes. The reaction was immediate pandemonium. The 6 passengers who had witnessed it became hysterical. They were screaming and crying, unable to comprehend what they had just seen. George, Diane, and Sis were also deeply shaken, but they knew they were in charge and had to maintain order. They tried to calm the distraught passengers while their own minds were racing. They told themselves that no one can just disappear. This man had to be hiding somewhere on the plane. They quickly organized a thorough search. For over an hour, the flight was delayed as the crews searched every single part of that plane, every closet, every overhead bin, every lavatory, every nook and cranny, but they found no trace of the man. After a very long delay, and with a very rattled group of passengers and crew, plane number 318 eventually took off. When they landed in Miami, the very first thing George, Diane, and Sis did was go to the operations office and file an official report detailing exactly what they had seen. But Eastern Airlines, it seemed, didn't want this story getting out. A couple of weeks later, when some other employees heard about the incident and wanted to read the report for themselves, the official logbook where these reports were kept had conspicuously gone missing. And when these employees asked their superiors about it, the official word from the company was that George, Diane, and Sis had never filed any such reports. The airline insisted that there was no vanishing person and that the whole story was a fabrication. But George, Diane, and Sis stood by their story. They knew they had filed those reports. And apparently, some other pilots at the airline had managed to see the reports before the logbook disappeared, and they would later tell others that what they had read was absolutely terrifying. Over the next 2 years, an astounding number of other completely unexplainable events would take place on various planes within the Eastern Airlines fleet. But there was a strange pattern to these occurrences. The bizarre events only seemed to happen on the L-1011 jets that had been fitted with salvaged parts from the wreckage of Flight 401. There were more sightings of the silent, seated captain who looked just like Bob Loft. In one instance, an Eastern Airlines vice president was on a flight when he saw the apparition of the captain sitting in a first-class seat. Just like before, the figure vanished into thin air right in front of him. The executive was so freaked out that he ran off the plane and demanded that the entire aircraft be searched from top to bottom. But, just like the last time, nothing was found. On another occasion, a member of a catering company that was loading food onto the lower level of an L-1011 right into the galley kitchen spotted a man who looked exactly like Don Repo, the flight engineer from Flight 401, wandering around the lower deck. The catering worker called out to the man, and the figure turned towards him, and then, just like Bob Loft, vanished into thin air. The catering crew was so frightened by this that they refused to go back on the plane, causing a massive delay. On another flight, this one on board plane number 318, again, the pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit started hearing a strange banging sound coming from below them from the hellhole. The pilot got up, opened the trapdoor, and climbed down into the compartment with a flashlight. He looked all around, but didn't see anything. But as he started to climb back up into the cockpit, he looked up, and standing there, looking down at him, was the figure of Don Repo. The apparition stared at him for a second, and then promptly vanished. On yet another flight, a female passenger in the main cabin, who had been sitting quietly for the entire journey, suddenly began screaming hysterically. When the flight attendants rushed over to her, she was pointing frantically at the empty seat next to her. She told them that a man had suddenly appeared in that seat. He didn't walk up the aisle, he just materialized right next to her. And then, when she started screaming, he disappeared just as suddenly. The woman was so traumatized by the experience that when the plane finally landed in Phoenix, Arizona, she had to be restrained in a straitjacket as she was taken off the plane. But as terrifying as all of these events were, there was at least one instance where these apparitions seemed to be trying to help. One captain reported that he walked into the cockpit before a flight and found the figure of flight engineer Don Repo standing there. Before the captain could react, the apparition of Don calmly told him about a specific and serious malfunction in one of the plane's engines. And then he vanished. The captain was horrified by what he had just seen, but he took the warning seriously. He had the maintenance crew look at the engine, and sure enough, they found the exact malfunction that the ghostly figure of Don Repo had described, a problem that could have been catastrophic if it hadn't been caught. Then, finally, in 1974, after nearly 2 years of these strange and unsettling events, it all just came to an abrupt stop. No one knows for sure why the sightings ended. But it was in 1974 that Eastern Airlines, despite publicly denying all the reports and insisting that nothing strange was happening, quietly made a significant change. They went through their entire fleet of L-1011 jets and systematically removed every single part that had been salvaged from the wreckage of Flight 401. They replaced perfectly good, expensive, and certified parts, and they never gave an official reason for doing so. And after they did that, the hauntings, the sightings of Bob Loft and Don Repo, all of it just stopped. And if there is one thing that makes the story of Flight 401 terrifying, it is that dozens of people, many of whom had never met, described seeing the deceased crew members exactly the same on completely different flights. And after Eastern Airlines quietly removed the salvaged wreckage from their planes, the sightings abruptly stopped. Thank you all very much for watching. In the event that any of you are able to figure out what actually took place before I reveal it at the conclusion of the show, I will be extremely surprised. But before I get into today's story, I want to say that if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have arrived at the right channel, because that is all we do, and we upload 3, 4, or even 5 times every week. In order to ensure that you do not miss any of our weekly uploads, we ask that you subscribe to this channel and enable all notifications. If you find that to be of interest, continue reading. All right, let's get started with the story for today. On the 15th of September 2010, it was approximately 8:30 o'clock in the evening. A man of 55 years of age was seen leaning back against his headboard in room 348 of the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. He appeared to be completely at ease about his situation. Because the air conditioning unit was turned down to its lowest setting, the room was chilly and had been chilled to the point of icy freezing. Next to him, on a towel that had been laid out, there was an open candy bar, an ashtray, a lighter, a cell phone, and a television remote control. He took a bite out of the candy, lit a cigarette with his right hand, and then flipped through the channels until he found Iron Man 2 on the television. It was a night that was completely unremarkable and quiet. Nevertheless, the television suddenly went dark without any prior warning. There was a flash of light. A dull and faint thud could be heard. It was so quiet and so unremarkable that it would have been easy for anyone to miss it. Over the course of a few minutes, the power was restored. Despite the fact that the television screen began to glow with life, the room continued to be eerily quiet. Because the air conditioner had been unable to restart, the hum that it had been producing had stopped. The man began to bolt out of bed all of a sudden. With a frantic and desperate rush, he made a beeline for the heavy wooden door that led to the hallway. He was looking for a way out of the room and something that would keep him safe. He was never able to succeed. After falling to his knees with great force, he abruptly fell to the ground and landed on his face in the middle of the carpet. A peculiar fact remained, despite the fact that his body was becoming increasingly chilly. His cigarette had been moved to his left hand, where it was tightly clamped between his fingers and was slowly burning all the way down to the ash. My impression was that it was a sudden and tragic medical emergency. Nevertheless, what was concealed behind the drywall of room 348 was a series of occurrences that were so peculiar and so sinister that they contradicted everything the authorities believed they knew about the ways in which a life could come to an end. One must examine the life of Greg Flanagan in order to comprehend the circumstances that led to this individual being found lying on the floor of that hotel room in Texas. Greg was 55 years old, a slender and fit-looking man with a white beard that was cropped close to the crown of his head and the rough, leathery skin of someone who had spent his entire life in the environment. It was a deceptive appearance because Greg never exercised, had a terrible diet, and smoked constantly. So the appearance was deceptive. During his younger years, Greg led a high-stakes life by working as a chief engineer on enormous ocean-going vessels. He was away from home for extended periods of time, spending numerous months at sea. However, as he approached the middle years of his life, he made the decision that he desired to be closer to his family and reimagined himself as a landman. As of this moment, it was his responsibility to travel and negotiate leases for mineral rights and land on behalf of oil drilling companies. Greg and Susie, his wife, led a peaceful and contented life together in Lafayette, Louisiana. Greg was deeply in love with Susie by the time they got married. Nevertheless, Greg was required to make a grueling 2-hour commute in his pickup truck from Lafayette all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company rented him a room for his work week. This was a requirement that he had to fulfill every Monday morning. Greg didn't care that the Elegante Hotel was nothing special. He couldn't care less. Not only did he not engage in social activities, but he also did not frequent the hotel bar located downstairs, and he was not concerned with luxury. All that was required of him was a television and a clean bed. His routine wasn't going to change. Every single night, he would go to his room, shut himself off from the rest of the world, turn up the temperature on the air conditioner until it was so cold that the room was shivering, and then watch television while smoking. On that particular Wednesday evening, Greg's wish for a peaceful evening was thwarted by a situation that was extremely frustrating. Using the microwave in his room, he had made the decision to prepare a pouch of popcorn. Greg was able to blow a fuse because the appliance drew an excessive amount of current, which caused the elderly electrical system to become overloaded. Almost instantly, the power had been cut off, leaving his room completely dark. The thing that Greg failed to recognize was that this was not merely a peculiar occurrence in his room. Because he had accidentally tripped the circuit breaker, the power had been cut off to the rooms that were directly to his left, to his right, and to the room at the bottom of the stairs. Following Greg's call to the front desk, a maintenance worker eventually arrived, walked to the breaker box, and turned the switch back on. Greg was able to restore power to the building. It was at 8:30 p.m. when the power was officially restored. As Greg's television began to flicker back on, he repositioned himself on his pillows under the impression that the minor annoyance had been resolved. He was completely unaware that this brief power outage had caused a chain reaction that would have catastrophic consequences among the strangers who were sleeping just a few inches away from him. When Greg and Susie woke up the following morning, the strict routine that had been keeping them connected fell apart. Before going to work each and every morning, Greg would always make sure to give his wife a good morning call. However, by 9 o'clock in the morning, Susie's phone had not rung. After experiencing a sudden surge of anxiety, she dialed his mobile phone number. Until it reached the voicemail, it continued to ring and ring. When she called his office in Beaumont, his coworkers answered the phone and informed her that Greg had not yet arrived for work. Susie begged his coworkers to drive over to the Elegante Hotel and check room 348 because she was terrified that something terrible was going to happen. When the two coworkers arrived, they placed a significant amount of pressure on the door, but they did not receive a response. After hurriedly descending the stairs, they seized the hotel manager and hurriedly ascended the stairs to unlock the door. They became completely immobile the moment the door opened. In the middle of the room, Greg Flanagan was motionless and lying on his back. The way he was positioned gave the impression that he had fallen to his knees and then collapsed onto the rug with his face facing forward. His left arm was tucked awkwardly beneath his chest, and the stub of a cigarette that had been burned out was still kept shut between his two left fingers. It no longer felt like a safe haven. The room had a profoundly unsettling atmosphere. The arrival of Detective Scott Apple at the scene occurred not long after the ambulance arrived. Apple was a veteran detective who was extremely fit and had spiked silver hair. He was a police officer who felt a deep passion for his work. After entering room 348, he was immediately struck by the room's unusually high temperature, which he found to be uncomfortably warm. It was like being in a sauna. Regarding Greg's body, however, there was no obvious indication that he had been in a struggle. In addition to the fact that the door had not been forced open, the room was clean, and Greg's wallet, which was located in the back pocket of his jeans, still contained a significant amount of cash. It was not difficult for Apple to rule out the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. During his examination of Greg's body, he discovered that there was no blood, no stab wounds, and no indications that he had been strangled. The only mark that could be seen was a very small and superficial abrasion on his cheek, which was caused by his face making contact with the rough carpet. Apple interviewed the guests who were staying in the rooms that were adjacent to one another, but nobody had heard a single scream, a gunshot, or any other sounds of violence. In the later hours of that day, Susie called Detective Apple while crying uncontrollably. In the midst of her sorrow, she shared with him, "My husband took terrible care of himself. He smoked like a chimney, had a terrible diet, and never saw a doctor. I always warned him that he was going to have a heart attack." The statement appeared to be both open and closed. Detective Apple, Greg Flanagan's family, and the staff at the hotel all arrived at the same conclusion. Greg Flanagan's unhealthy lifestyle had at long last caught up with him. A tragic and solitary death brought on by natural causes occurred. The narrative, however, was completely shattered when the body of Greg was brought into the morgue of Dr. Tommy Brown, the veteran medical examiner for Beaumont. Having read the initial police notes, Dr. Brown was fully prepared to confirm that the patient had suffered a heart attack. Greg's body appeared to be in perfect condition from the outside, with the exception of a scratch on his cheek and a second, seemingly insignificant laceration that was located close to his knee. However, the moment that Dr. Brown arrived to perform the internal examination, he let out a gasp. One could say that the interior of Greg Flanagan's body was nothing short of a slaughterhouse. There was a complete and total influx of blood into his torso. His ribs were broken, his internal organs were severely lacerated, and his intestines had been violently ruptured. His external organs were also severely damaged. The fact that a massive, clean hole had been torn straight through his heart was the most shocking piece of information. When Dr. Brown looked at the injuries, he saw that they were so severe that they were typically only seen in people who had been crushed under heavy industrial machinery or in victims of high-speed head-on car collisions. Despite this, Greg did not have any crushing injuries on his skin, and his chest did not have any broken skin. Additionally, his hotel room was very clean. Almost immediately, Dr. Brown placed a call to Detective Apple. A heart attack was not the cause of death, according to the medical examiner. This is a homicide. Someone beat this man to death from the inside out. Due to the fact that the facts involved in this investigation were in direct opposition to one another, the entire investigation was thrown into disarray. Why did Greg's chest not show any signs of bruising if he had been repeatedly beaten to death with such force that it would have caused his heart to rupture? Due to the fact that the walls of the hotel were so thin, why had not a single person been able to hear the sounds of a brutal and fatal assault? More importantly, the timeline did not make any sense when it was aligned with the physical state of the room. In order to concentrate on the intense heat that was present in the room, Detective Apple returned to the logs. At 8:30 in the evening, the maintenance worker reset the breaker, which resulted in the television turning back on. However, in order for the older air conditioning system to begin cooling again, it was necessary for someone to physically press the power button. It is likely that Greg did not notice the air wasn't running right away because the room was already cold as a result of the full evening's worth of air conditioning. On the other hand, Beaumont in September is extremely hot. Greg would be required to get up and turn it back on because the room would have rapidly warmed up within 30 to 45 minutes in that time frame. Given that the room was discovered to be sweltering with heat, it is reasonable to assume that Greg passed away not long after the power was restored, and more specifically, between the hours of 8:30 and 9 p.m., before the heat became unbearable enough to cause him to move. However, the cigarette was the most significant and obvious piece of evidence that rendered the possibility of a physical beating impossible. A cigarette was found in Greg's left hand when the body was discovered. Greg was holding it tightly. A bombshell was dropped by Susie when Detective Apple called her to double-check a particular detail. She revealed that Greg was a right-handed person who had never used his left hand to smoke. Consider the physical characteristics of that space. In the event that Greg was sitting on his bed, smoking with his right hand, and an intruder suddenly burst in and began beating him to death, Greg's natural reflex would have been to either put his hands up to defend himself, fight back, or drop the cigarette. If the cigarette had been dropped on the floor or crushed on the bed, it would have been a terrible mess. If it had been transferred smoothly to his left hand, which was not his dominant hand, it would have remained kept shut between his fingers as he collapsed to the floor, and it would have burned cleanly down to the skin. The cigarette was evidence that whatever trauma caused Greg's internal organs to be destroyed, it occurred so suddenly and unexpectedly that he didn't even realize he was dying as he stood up and walked toward that door. Initially, the theories that a heart attack or a brutal beating was the cause of death were completely debunked. The investigators were left standing in the middle of room 348, staring at a medical impossibility while looking at a room that was spotless. The cigarette was evidence that whatever trauma caused Greg's internal organs to be destroyed, it occurred so suddenly and unexpectedly that he didn't even realize he was dying as he stood up and walked toward that door. Initially, the theories that a heart attack or a brutal beating was the cause of death were completely debunked. The investigators were left standing in the middle of room 348, staring at a medical impossibility while looking at a room that was spotless, in light of the fact that every piece of evidence they had contradicted the laws of physics and that there were no indications of an intruder or a weapon. The investigation was completely abandoned. The investigation came to a complete and utter halt for a period of 7 arduous months. Unfortunately for Greg's bereaved family, there were no leads, no suspects, and absolutely no answers to be found there. Susie was so desperate for answers that she made the decision to take matters into her own hands and engage the services of Ken Brennan, a well-known private investigator. He was famous for his sharp instincts and his track record of solving seemingly impossible cold cases. Brennan was a former police officer on Long Island and a special agent for the Drug Enforcement Administration. As a larger-than-life character, he spoke with a thick New York accent and wore tight t-shirts that displayed his muscular frame. He was a character that was larger than life. When Brennan flew down to Louisiana to meet Susie, he did not simply go through the files, rather he looked for the human details that the official reports always seemed to overlook. He questioned Susie about Greg's most intimate routines, and it was at that moment that she reiterated the information regarding the cigarette. Greg had never smoked with his left hand outside of the house. The thoughts in Brennan's head started to race. When he came to this realization, he realized that the physical condition of Greg's body was not the result of a prolonged fight, but rather a sudden and desperate reaction to a single catastrophic moment. He went to Beaumont and joined forces with Detective Apple, who was more than willing to share his files with him. Together, they worked together. On that particular evening, Brennan locked himself in his hotel room and spread the photographs of the autopsy and the diagrams of the crime scene across the bed. The peculiar aspect of the cigarette that was held in his left hand captivated his attention. How could Greg possibly switch hands if he was sitting on his bed watching television while holding a cigarette in his right hand? If he were to suddenly experience excruciating pain, what would cause him to switch hands? In spite of its apparent simplicity, the response was quite elegant. Greg was attempting to flee. A person who is right-handed will instinctively reach for the doorknob with their dominant right hand in order to open a heavy hotel door. Greg had moved the cigarette that was on fire to his left hand in order to free up his right hand so that he could turn the deadbolt and open the door to the safe area. Even though he was trying to escape with his life, his heart stopped beating just a few feet away from the exit. On the other hand, what could possibly crush the internal organs of a man from across the room without leaving any physical trace? When Brennan wanted to get a sense of the space, he knew he had to stand in room 348. As they made their way back into the hotel room, he and Detective Apple were alone. In order to locate the invisible line that led from the bed to the door, Brennan examined the furniture, including the carpet, the ceiling, and the walls. Suddenly, his gaze was drawn to a particular location on the wall that was located close to the entrance. It was a small area of fresh drywall compound that did not match the rest of the wall. Apple shrugged and said that it was just a standard repair from the point where the doorknob hits the wall when the door swings open too hard. Apple noticed that he was looking at it. In spite of this, Brennan was not content. The heavy door was grabbed by him, and he swung it open all the way until the knob was pressed against the wall. The knob landed a few centimeters to the right of the hole that had been patched. When it came to the door, the patch had absolutely nothing to do with it. A chill ran through Brennan's veins. After exiting the building and entering the hallway, he made a left turn and knocked on the door of room 349, which was the room that was immediately adjacent to Greg's. Apple proceeded to use the manager's key in order to gain access to the room, which was currently unoccupied. Brennan proceeded to walk straight to the wall that was shared by everyone. When he started running his hands over the wallpaper, he was looking for any imperfections. He continued to do this until his fingers came into contact with a small lump that was solid. More closely, he looked. A chunk of white toothpaste that had hardened had been crudely stuffed into the hole, which was a very small hole. Taking his finger, Brennan exerted a great deal of force. In the process of falling into the cavity, the dry plug of toothpaste popped right through the wall. Immediately, Detective Apple contacted the forensic team to arrive at the scene. For the purpose of preserving the small tunnel, they brought in a specialized crime scene unit to carefully excavate both sides of the drywall. After the path had been cleared, a forensic technician mounted a powerful laser pointer inside room 349 and pointed it in a direction that would allow it to directly penetrate the hole. After passing through the wall, the red laser beam traveled across the empty space of room 348 and painted a bright red dot directly onto the pillowcases of the queen-size bed. This was the exact location where Greg Flanagan's torso would have been leaning against the headboard. The pieces of the impossible puzzle were shattered and reformed into a terrifying new reality almost immediately after they were broken. The individual known as Greg Flanagan had not been assaulted, nor had he experienced a heart attack. It was a gunshot wound. Brennan and Apple made a hasty return to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and demanded that he re-examine the photographs that were taken during the autopsy. Due to the fact that Greg's body had already been cremated, the only thing that remained were the photographs. Brennan directed his attention directly to the minuscule superficial laceration that was located in Greg's crotch. This was the laceration that Dr. Brown had deemed relatively minor. When viewed through the lens of a ballistics trajectory, that scratch was actually a perfectly round entrance wound that was devoid of any blood flowing through it. A bullet that was traveling through the wall at a low angle had struck Greg in the back, traveled upward through his lower abdomen, shredded his internal organs, and punched a clean hole right through his heart. This occurred because Greg was lounging on the bed at the time. The speed at which the bullet enters the body generates a hydrostatic shockwave, which is a massive internal pressure that literally explodes the organs from the inside out. This is a perfect imitation of the internal trauma that occurs when a high-speed car crash occurs. The tight elasticity of the skin at the entry point sealed the wound, preventing any bleeding from occurring outside of the body. This is the reason why there was no blood in the room. The mystery surrounding the murder weapon that was invisible has been solved. Greg was killed in complete silence as a result of a stray bullet that had worked its way through the wall. The investigation shifted its attention entirely to the people who were staying in room 349 on the evening of September 15, after the laser beam had locked the two rooms together in a trajectory that would ultimately result in their deaths. Both Detective Apple and Brennan were aware that they needed to have a conversation with the two electricians, Lance and Mueller, who had been staying at the location. However, after 7 months, they were unable to simply storm in with handcuffs. They required a confession, and they needed to conduct themselves in a strategic manner. The first thing that they did was locate Lance, and then they brought him into the station under the guise of a routine administrative update. While sitting opposite him, Detective Apple displayed complete composure and placed a document that had been typed on the metal table. "Look, Lance," Apple effortlessly said, "it's been over 7 months since Greg Flanagan died next door to you. We're just cleaning up the old files. This is a formal statement attesting to what you told us the first time, that you didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, and went to bed. We just need you to sign it so we can close the book." Lance made his way over to the paper. It appeared as though he was completely at ease, even sympathetic. He responded with a, "Yeah, absolutely," while picking up a pen. "Like I told you back then, we were out at the bar, came back, and heard the guy coughing. We had no idea anything happened to him. I wish I could help you guys more. Lance put pen to paper and signed his name, thereby officially locking himself into his alibi. I wish I could. Immediately after the pen was removed from the paper, the temperature in the interrogation room dropped to an extremely low level. The New York accent that Ken Brennan spoke with cut through the stillness of the room like a knife. He leaned forward. All right, Lance. Gotcha. Here's the problem. We just came from your hotel room. We found the bullet hole. We know a gun was fired from room 349, we know the bullet went through the wall, and we know that bullet is exactly what killed the man next door. And right here, you just signed a legal document lying to the police. So, here is how this is going to go. Either you tell me exactly who pulled that trigger right now, or you are going to jail for obstructing justice and filing a false police report. Almost immediately, Lance's face lost all of its youthful color. The calm and cooperative demeanor vanished, and he completely disintegrated into a million pieces. As he buried his face in his hands, trembling, the truth eventually came out of his mouth. During the evening of the incident, he explained that he and Mueller were in a state of rage when the power suddenly switched off. As a result of their heavy drinking, the sudden darkness only served to exacerbate their drunken agitation of the situation. In the room 349, the two men continued their partying after the maintenance man had restored the electricity at 8:30 o'clock in the evening. Mueller eventually made the decision to flaunt his abilities. It was then that he returned to the hotel room where he had brought his semi-automatic pistol, which he had retrieved from his truck. Mueller started acting recklessly, laughing, and playing the tough guy while waving the loaded gun around to get people's attention. In his statement, Lance stated that he was terrified and that he repeatedly told Mueller to put the weapon away before anyone was hurt. However, Mueller did not pay attention. Mueller aimed the pistol in a playful manner at Lance's chest while he was under the influence of strong alcohol. When Lance felt himself beginning to panic, he instinctively reached out and pushed Mueller's hand away in order to deflect the round. As he struck Mueller's arm, the gun, which Mueller had been holding, fell out of his grasp. The weapon caw, it discharged as it fell heavily onto the nightstand or the floor, and upon impact from the impact, it discharged. Room 349 was filled with the deafening sound of a bang. It was filled with smoke, and both of the men froze in complete and utter terror. When they looked at the wall, they noticed a completely clean and minuscule hole that had been punched through the wallpaper and led directly into room 348. Lance and Mueller remained immobile against the wall for a number of agonizing minutes, holding their breath and listening for any indication of whether or not there was any sign of life coming from the other side. They anticipated hearing yelling, cursing, or the frantic sounds of someone calling the front desk. They were prepared for an uproar. In contrast, there was nothing. There was complete silence in the room next door. Considering that Greg had quietly collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air as he took his last breath, the two electricians were under the impression that the room was currently empty. Despite the fact that they were relieved, they were still shaken, so they made the decision to flee the scene and went to the local bar to drink away their frustration. Lance asserted that they heard a muffled coughing sound coming from room 348 when they returned to the hotel later that night. The sound was described as light and wet. In point of fact, this was most likely the sound of fluid accumulating in the lungs of the dying man, or it could have been their own guilty minds playing tricks on them. In their eyes, however, it was a confirmation that the person who lived next door was still alive and doing well. They believed that they were completely free from any consequences. This was not until the following morning that the true panic began to set in. When Lance looked out their window, he recalled seeing the flashing lights of the ambulance and the cruiser driven by Detective Apple. As Greg's body was being transported out of the hotel under a white sheet, they watched in horror as it was being transported. Exactly at that moment, they were aware of it. They were aware that their bullet had struck him. While they were gathering their belongings to leave, they happened to overhear Detective Apple conducting an open interview with other guests as he was walking down the hallway. They heard Apple say out loud, "Yeah, it looks like a tragic heart attack. The guy didn't take care of himself." There do not appear to be any signs of foul play. Lance acknowledged that the experience of hearing those words was akin to a miracle. They were able to persuade themselves that it was nothing more than a peculiar and one-in-a-million coincidence that at the precise moment that they fired a rogue bullet through the wall, the man next door happened to have a fatal heart attack completely unrelated to them. On a deeper level, however, the feelings of guilt and fear continued to exist. Mueller took a tube of white toothpaste from the bathroom, squeezed it into the drywall to cover the entry wound, and then they fled Beaumont, concealing the gun and praying that the universe would keep their dark secret hidden for all of eternity. Mueller did this before checking out. The weight of Lance's confession completely shattered the illusion of a perfect coincidence that had been previously holding up. Following the revelation of the truth on the interrogation table, the state of Texas moved quickly to take action. Detective Apple and Ken Brennan were successful in obtaining an arrest warrant for Mueller, which allowed them to locate him and seize the concealed pistol. Ballistics testing confirmed that the pistol's trajectory and fragments were identical to those that were already present in room 348. Manslaughter is the legal definition of recklessly causing the death of another individual. Mueller was officially arrested and indicted on a charge of manslaughter. It was his partner's signed testimony and the forensic evidence that left him with no defense, despite the fact that he had initially attempted to conceal himself behind the wall that was stained with toothpaste. After being confronted with the fact that he would be sitting before a grand jury, Mueller ultimately pleaded guilty. Even though the tragedy was caused by such profound stupidity and gross negligence, the judge did not show much mercy for the situation. As part of his sentence, Mueller was required to serve 10 years in a state prison. Lance was able to avoid the manslaughter charge because he cooperated fully with the investigation and demonstrated that he had actively attempted to deflect the weapon rather than operate it. However, he will be subject to legal consequences for his role in the initial cover-up, and he will ultimately receive probation in exchange for his state's evidence. Following the conclusion of the legal battle, the gavel had been dropped, and the state regarded the case of Greg Flanagan as having been officially closed. However, the conclusion of a criminal trial rarely imparts a genuine sense of tranquility, and the sense of closure that can be found in a courtroom is frequently nothing more than a legal illusion. When Susie Flanagan heard the knock on the door on that bright September morning, it was a moment that would forever change her world. She had been haunted by the agonizing belief that her husband's own unhealthy habits, the very lifestyle that she had warned him about for years, had taken him away from her. She had lived with this belief for several months. A different kind of cruelty was revealed when it was discovered that his death was actually the result of two drunk strangers playing a reckless game of chance just inches away from him. It was necessary for Susie to confront the fact that her house had suddenly become excessively quiet, that her routine had been irrevocably disrupted, and that she had the unsettling awareness of how close she had come to never knowing the truth. However, if it weren't for her own obstinate intuition, that nagging feeling that Greg would never have left the air conditioning turned off the file on room 348 would still be sitting in a box, labeled as a natural death for a long time to come. While the case was resolved, the void that Mueller's 10-year sentence had left in her life remained completely unaffected by the outcome of the investigation. The residents of Beaumont and the employees of the Elegante Hotel were left to attempt to come to terms with an unsettling and unnoticeable reality. After walking the hallways for years, law enforcement officers and forensic teams made the realization that it is very simple for a violent crime to conceal itself as a quiet tragedy. A local legend was born out of the thin drywall that was found in room 348. It served as a stark reminder of how susceptible we are all to the covert actions of the individuals who were located on the other side of the wall. The final moments of Greg Flanagan are characterized by a macabre and eerie quality that lingers over them. An image of a man who spent his youth navigating the perilous and unpredictable depths of the open ocean, surviving the fierce storms of the sea, only to meet his end while resting on a quiet hotel bed on a Tuesday night, is an image that comes to mind. A man who, in his final moments of consciousness, did not even realize that he had been shot, is the subject of this particular detail. His perception was that he was merely going through the motions of a sudden and excruciating pain in a room that was becoming uncomfortably warm. He moved his cigarette to the other side of his body, stood up, and attempted to open a door that led to a corridor that was crowded with people who could save him. He passed away in complete seclusion, only 2 feet away from a place of safety, while his assailants stood on the opposite side of his wall, listening to the silence that surrounded him. There are times when the world moves in ways that are completely beyond our ability to control, and the structures that we construct in order to protect ourselves are much more fragile than they appear to be first glance. Neither a grand conspiracy nor a deep-seated hatred was the cause of Greg Flanagan's death. Rather, his life was taken. The reason for the conclusion of the situation was that a piece of metal penetrated a few inches of the paper and the CAO, transforming a peaceful evening spent watching television into a last-ditch effort to beat the clock. The spaces that we occupy, the rooms that we sleep in, and the people who live just a breath away from us are all things that cause you to wonder about. After tucking ourselves into bed, we turn off the lights and have faith that the walls will keep the outside world out of our space. On the other hand, as the tale of room 348 demonstrates, there are times when the wall is nothing more than an illusion, and the things that haunt us do not always come knocking on the front door. In the latter part of the summer of 2010, a man by the name of Ben McDaniel, who was 30 years old, was attempting to begin his life anew. On the surface, it might have appeared that everything was well. He was following a brand new and interesting activity when he was living in the sunny panhandle of Florida. Ben, on the other hand, was bearing a significant burden underneath. His hometown was Collierville, Tennessee, and it was there that he had established a prosperous construction company using his own 2 hands. He took great pride in it. However, when the housing market collapsed in 2008, his company went out of business, and it went out of business rather badly. In the end, he was left with nothing but debt, and a significant amount of it, amounting to almost $50,000. An individual who had given everything he had into his work was dealt a devastating blow by this. However, the financial loss was not even the most significant aspect of the situation. Before that, Ben had suffered the loss of his younger brother Paul a couple of years earlier. Due to the fact that Paul had suffered a stroke, Ben and his parents were left in utter disarray after his passing. Paul, on the other hand, was the more careful and grounded sibling, whereas Ben had always been the one who took risks and was the most adventurous. Ben's life was profoundly altered by the loss of him, and he had a difficult time coping with the pain that he felt. Shelby and Patty, his parents, watched as their surviving son drifted off into the distance. Despite the fact that he was depressed and disoriented, he was searching for something, anything, to satisfy his emptiness. His marriage had also ended in divorce, which was simply another aspect of his previous life that had disintegrated beyond repair. As a result, Ben came to the conclusion that he needed a significant shift. He relocated to Ponce de Leon, Florida, leaving behind his life in Tennessee, or what was remained of it, and brought his belongings with him. Scuba diving was the new hobby that he had discovered, and it was something that appeared to make him feel like he had a purpose once more. More specifically, he felt compelled to go to a location known as Vortex Spring. It is a lovely natural spring that produces a wide pool before feeding into a massive underwater cave system, making it a popular location for divers to visit. Ben was completely committed. He hired a tiny trailer on the property that was owned by the owner of the spring, and he committed himself entirely to exploring the underwater world. Within a relatively short period of time, he was able to move his certifications from open water diver to more advanced certification. He became certified extremely quickly. Nearly every single day, he would be found there, swimming in the crystal clear water that was refreshing. Ben saw the undersea environment as a means of making his escape. At that point, it appeared as though the burden of his financial obligations and his sorrow simply vanished. He was able to simply be there because it was a serene and placid location. However, a few of the other divers who were part of the close-knit society that existed at Vortex Spring saw something else in Ben. They observed a man who was going too far and moving too quickly with things. Cavern diving is widely considered to be among the most hazardous sports in the world. Having an extraordinary amount of patience, precise planning, and a profound regard for the harsh environment are all necessary components. Cave divers with years of experience, and often even decades of experience, spent developing their skills. On the other hand, Ben appeared to be in a hurry most of the time. It was his goal to dominate the cave, to go further and deeper than anyone else had ever gone before. It was said that he had a cowboyish presence, and even that he was haughty. It is said that he expressed a desire to find a way to pass through a particularly tight and perilous restriction deep into the cave, which was a location that experienced explorers had believed to be inaccessible. The thought of exploring new areas of the cave and establishing a reputation for himself was something that he was entirely preoccupied with. Some of his close friends and family members were concerned that he was not taking the risks seriously enough and that his desire to change his identity was causing him to act in a risky manner. As the sun began to set on the 18th of August 2010, Ben prepared himself for yet another dive. There were lengthy shadows cast across the sea as the sun was about to set. As he made his way to the end of the pier, the heavy gear he was carrying rumbled with each step he took. He wore his mask around his neck, his tanks were on his back, and he was holding his fins in his hand. The act was something that he had performed 100 times before. After a few period of gazing out over the lake, he quickly pulled his mask over his face, placed his regulator in his mouth, and then walked off the edge, sinking beneath the surface with a splash. The entrance to the cave was a dark maw at the bottom of the spring basin, perhaps 50 feet below the surface. He was moving in that direction. The light from his headlamp cut a beam through the blue water as he fell through the water without any difficulty. As soon as he reached the entryway, he continued on his way into the darkness. In the field of cave diving, the initial explanation put out to explain what took place after that was straightforward and sadly common. It was around 7:30 that evening that the staff at the Vortex Spring diving shop, a guy called Chuck Cronin and the owner's son, Lowell Kelly, reported seeing Ben enter the dive shop for his dive. They were aware that he was a devoted diver who frequently went in by himself. They did not instantly get concerned when he did not come to the surface after a few hours had passed. It is possible that divers, particularly those who are investigating the cave, could be down for an extended period of time. However, as the night progressed and there was still no trace of him, a stoic concern started to develop underneath the surface. The next day, when he still hadn't come up, that worry grew into genuine terror due to the circumstance. At that moment, his truck was still parked in the lot. There was only his dog in his trailer by himself. The situation was not right. At the same time as the authorities were contacted, a search operation was initiated. Once the Walton County Sheriff's Office arrived, it was immediately apparent to everyone that the initial assumption was correct. It was discovered that Ben McDaniel, a diver with a relatively low level of experience who was notorious for testing his limits, had entered a hazardous underwater cave and had not emerged from it. There must have been some kind of mishap. In one of the cave's winding side channels, he might have become disoriented and lost his way. It was possible for him to become trapped in a restrictive situation. It's possible that his apparatus broke down. It's possible that he went out of breath. The cave had a reputation for being a murderer. One of the signs that was placed close to the entrance was a gloomy warning to divers about the dangers that they faced. It was a stark reminder of the many other people who had died in its depths throughout the years. The narrative appeared to be written by itself. The cave had taken another victim, and this time it was Ben McDaniel. In the context of this particular sport, it was a tragedy, but it was a risk that was acknowledged. Instead of being a rescue mission, the mission was now a recovery mission. In order to locate his body, they were going inside. The search for Ben McDaniel was a massive effort that was fraught with a great deal of vulnerability. Finding a body in a setting that is simply open water is already a challenging task. There is a completely different level of difficulty involved in locating one within a cave system that is flooded, such as Vortex Spring. There are a number of narrow channels that wind their way through the cave. The floor is coated in a fine silt that has the consistency of talcum powder. Even the slightest touch from a hand or a fin can cause a cloud of this silt to be kicked up, which can reduce visibility to zero in a matter of seconds. It is referred to as a silt out, and it is one of the worst nightmares that a cave diver may experience. It is possible to become utterly bewildered, to the point where you are unable to see your hand in front of your face and to locate the guideline that will bring you back to a secure location. As a result of these dangers, the sheriff's office was forced to bring in the most qualified individuals possible, cave rescue and recovery divers who are volunteers and have had extensive training. They were individuals who willingly went into locations where other people had passed away, putting their own lives in danger in order to provide a family with some sense of closure. It was on August 20th, 2 days after Ben was last seen, that the first teams entered the building. They proceeded in accordance with the primary guideline that could be found in the cave's most often visited areas. As they searched every nook and cranny, their strong lights penetrating the murky water, they looked for any indication that Ben may be present. A person, a piece of equipment, a fin, a mask, or anything else may have been what they were looking for. And still, they discovered nothing. A peculiar and unnerving pattern started to emerge as the first day of seeking moved into a second, and then a third, as the 3 days of searching continued. All traces of Ben McDaniel were completely absent from the scene. As they progressed deeper into the cave system, the divers entered the more hazardous areas of the cave. After that, they headed to the location where it was said that Ben was preoccupied with discovering a new tunnel. Every single dead end and every single small compartment was investigated. Nothing has changed. Certainly, this was not the norm. It is extremely simple to locate the deceased in the vast majority of cave diving accidents that result in fatalities. The majority of the time, they are discovered with all of their gear on, entangled in the guideline, or constrained by a restriction. The cave has a way of retaining its victims. However, in this particular instance, the cave appeared to be devoid of any inhabitants. An odd discovery was uncovered after a couple of days had passed since the beginning of the hunt. There was a discovery of 2 of Ben's diving tanks. On the other hand, they were not discovered far within the cave, which is where you would anticipate them to be if he had dropped them in the event of an emergency. They were discovered in the open water basin, which was located outside the entrance to the cave. The employee of the dive shop, Chuck Cronin, said that he discovered them. This was the first piece of information that did not appear to be consistent with the straightforward accident account. That 2 of his tanks were located outside of the cave is a mystery. It is common practice for divers to position stage bottles at specific points in order to retrieve them later for longer dives. Nevertheless, the positioning of these bottles was peculiar. The results did not appear to be consistent with any of the typical cave diving procedures. Despite the peculiar discovery, the search that was being conducted inside the cave continued. They were unrelenting in their pursuit. They looked on for several days. They went so far as to bring in specialized equipment in order to attempt to blast through a rock pile that was blocking a narrow tunnel that Ben had been interested in. They were under the impression that Ben had managed to pass through the obstruction and is now stuck on the other side. On the other hand, the endeavor was not only risky, but also ultimately failed. It was decided to call off the official search after nearly a week of intense, high-risk searching, during which more than a dozen professional divers searched every available inch of the cave. They had not discovered anything. Ben and his equipment were completely absent from the scene. It was said by the primary investigator for the sheriff's office that if Ben was indeed there in the cave, his body would be located in a section that was just inaccessible to rescue workers. According to the official record, it was thought that Ben McDaniel had drowned, and his body was reported to have been lost forever in the gloomy and silent depths of Vortex Spring. It was impossible for Shelby and Patty McDaniel, Ben's parents, to believe the official explanation that was provided and accepted it. It is incomprehensible that their son, along with all of his heavy diving equipment, including his tanks, his fins, his weight belt, and his lights, could suddenly disappear without a trace inside that cave. Quite simply, it was completely illogical. When it came to his dives, they were aware that their son was a risk-taker for sure, but they also knew that he was a thorough planner. He meticulously documented each and every dive that he went on. To them, the concept that he would simply vanish without a trace from their lives seemed illogical. Although they were experiencing a great deal of loss, they were also developing a strong sense of distrust. The sensation that they were not being told the complete story was something that they were unable to shake. They acted in the manner that any other parent would. They were not willing to give up. They secured the services of Kelly Fleischman, a well-known private investigator hailing from the state of Florida. In addition, they offered a hefty reward, which finally reached $30,000 for any information that could lead to the rescue of their son. The investigation into the case was initiated by Fleischman, who conducted more interviews with witnesses and examined the facts with a new perspective. And as she continued to look, the straightforward diving accident idea started to entirely disintegrate before her own sights. Not only did she discover a single problem in the narrative, but she discovered an entire string of them. The 2 air tanks that were discovered outside of the cave were the first major problem that needed to be addressed. An examination of the air carried within them was carried out. As it turned out, they were filled with the typical compressed air that is found in the atmosphere. The kind of deep, sophisticated cave diving that Ben was purportedly undertaking would have required him to use specialized gas combinations, such as nitrox or trimix, in order to avoid oxygen poisoning and nitrogen narcosis. Although Ben was known for his recklessness, it was highly doubtful that he would have made the rookie mistake of using plain air at the depths that he was purportedly exploring. This would have been an extremely dangerous situation. Even stranger was the fact that the tanks were found to be almost completely full. Just a little bit less air was contained within them than they would have been immediately after being filled. It was clear from this that Ben had only used them for a little period of time, if he had used them at all. What was the rationale behind him bringing 2 large tanks into the water, using them for a minute or 2, and then leaving them outside the cave afterwards? Under any diving circumstance, it was completely illogical to do so. After that, Fleischman began investigating the employees of Vortex Spring, namely the 2 workers who were the last to see Ben and who were involved in the search for the tanks. These workers were Chuck Cronin and Lowell Kelly, the owner's son. It was the private investigator's opinion that their accounts were inconsistent with one another. It seemed as though their time frames of when they had last seen Ben and when they became aware that he was missing were slightly different from one another with each new account. It was hardly a conclusive piece of evidence, but it was sufficient to raise suspicions. In addition to this, Fleischman discovered some peculiar information regarding Ben's life around the time that he disappeared. He was in possession of two mobile phones. While he was in the parking lot, one was discovered in his truck. There was a lack of the other. The truck also had his wallet, which contained his identification as well as his credit card. If he was only going to go for a dive, we don't see why he would leave his wallet behind. The vast majority of individuals would keep it safe in their vehicle. It was discovered that his dog, a cherished companion that he kept with him everywhere he went, was locked inside his small trailer without any food or water. The fact that Ben would ignore his animal in such a manner, even for only one evening, appeared to be cruel and out-of-character behavior. In addition, the condition of his trailer was very questionable. At first glance, it appeared as though someone had tried to use it. Unfortunately, a few of his personal possessions were not found. Moreover, there was the issue of his diving logs to consider. The entry in Ben's journal for his final dive, which took place on August 18th, appeared to be incorrect. Ben was obsessed with keeping a log of his dives. Some others questioned whether or not the handwriting was even his. It was hasty and lacking in information, and it was not at all like his earlier entries that were extensive. It appeared as though it had been filled out by someone else in order to make a record of a dive that might not have actually taken place in the manner that it was portrayed. Despite the fact that the cave itself was intended to be the repository of all the answers, the cave itself was the source of the most significant flaw, the one that completely destroyed the official idea. Over the course of the subsequent couple of years, the McDaniel family supported a number of more private searches of the cave by spending their own personal funds. They had a strong desire to locate their son, or at the very least, to demonstrate that he was not present. Ed Sorensen, a man who is considered to be a legend in the world of cave diving, was hired by them in the year 2012. With his seemingly superhuman ability to traverse and explore the most perilous and tightest underwater caves on the world, Sorensen has earned a reputation for being an exceptional cave explorer. When nobody else is willing or able to go, people look to him as the person to go for recovery. In the history of Vortex Spring, Sorensen carried out one of the most extensive searches that have ever been completed. He remained in the cave for several days. He was able to circumvent constraints that were so tight that he had to remove his gear and squeeze through the openings on the side. Through his exploration of the cave system, he traveled further than any of the previous search parties had gone. He looked into every possible option, every rumor, and every lead that was available. His goal was to find any indication of a human body or any pieces of equipment. His conclusion was unquestionable and immovable, despite everything that had transpired. In a public statement, he asserted with complete and utter certainty that the body of Ben McDaniel was not found contained within the Vortex Spring Cave. He stated that there was no physical method for a body to have entered the areas of the cave that had not been inspected, regardless of whether or not tools were present. In the event that Ben had passed away inside that cave, Ed Sorensen would have located him. He did not discover anything. A single remark made by an expert has completely altered everything. Could you please tell me where Ben was if he wasn't in the cave? There was no longer any basis for believing the claim of a terrible diving catastrophe. Another event had taken place on the 18th of August in the year 2010. Following Ed Sorensen's exhaustive investigation, which proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the accident explanation was not true, two new options emerged, each of which was more sinister and intricate than the one that came before it. In the course of the inquiry, which was now being led by Ben's family and their private investigator, an attempt was made to piece together what might have actually occurred on that particular evening. First, there was the possibility of some kind of criminal activity. Kelly Fleischman, a private investigator, came to the conclusion that Ben had been murdered and that his disappearance had been manufactured to appear as though it was an accident that occurred while he was diving. Putting this hypothesis back together, the reconstruction looks somewhat like this. The fact that Ben was not liked by everyone at Vortex Spring was something that had been established. A man who did not respect the established order in the community, he was perceived as being haughty. He was exerting a lot of effort in order to gain entry to the more hazardous and gated-off area of the cave, which was a privilege that was only granted to the most reliable and experienced divers. It's possible that he got into a disagreement with someone at the dive shop on that particular evening. Perhaps the dispute became more heated. It is possible that a confrontation takes happen in this situation, possibly on the pier or in close proximity to the ocean. The situation escalates into a physical confrontation, and Ben is either killed unintentionally or on purpose. The individual or individuals concerned are currently experiencing a state of panic. They are currently dealing with a deceased individual in a well-known tourist site. A cover narrative is required, and they need to get rid of it as soon as possible. And what could be a more fitting cover tale than an accident that occurred while cave diving at a well-known location? They are aware that if they are able to make it appear as though Ben was lost and perished in the cave, then it is possible that his body will never be located and no individuals will ask an excessive amount of questions. Therefore, they carry out their plan while doing so under the cover of darkness. They remove Ben's body and dispose of it in a location that is very far away from Vortex Spring, specifically a location where it will never be discovered again. Following that, they collect some of his diving equipment. For the purpose of giving the impression that he drove himself to the parking lot, they drive his truck there. They steal 2 of his tanks, which may have been the most convenient ones they could grab, which explains why they were filled with the incorrect kind of air. The tanks are dropped right beyond the entrance to the cave, generating a piece of evidence that is misleading. They walk down to the water and drop the tanks. To further their efforts to sell the tale, they may have even fabricated the final entry in his dive log. They then wait for a day and discover that Ben is missing, at which point they report him as a diver who has gone missing. Despite the fact that they are well aware that the cave will not provide any results, they focus the search in that direction. Each piece of evidence that lends credence to this viewpoint is convincing. The fact that Ben and his heavy gear were never discovered in the cave is explained by this explanation. It provides an explanation for the tanks that were put in an unusual manner and contained the incorrect air mixture. It provides an explanation for the inconsistencies that were stated by the staff of the dive shop, who the family feels were engaged in the incident. Lowell Kelly, the owner's son, has been singled out as the person on whom the family has placed the blame. Although they first brought a lawsuit against him for wrongful death, the case was eventually dismissed. They are of the opinion that he, along with possibly others, had a reason to harm Ben and the opportunity to cover it up. However, the local law enforcement has indicated that they have never discovered sufficient evidence to identify any suspects or treat the case as a homicide after they investigated the case. A very different picture of Ben McDaniel is painted by the second main theory, which is just as astonishing as the first major theory. The hypothesis of a staged disappearance is expressed in this way. Based on this reconstruction, it appears that Ben was not the victim of any kind of criminal activity, but rather the mastermind of his own disappearance. We are aware that Ben was during a very difficult period in his life. It was $50,000 worth of debt that he was drowning in. He was still in a state of mourning over the death of his brother. His company had been unsuccessful. He was feeling dejected and desperately looking for a way out, a new beginning. According to this scenario, Ben carefully planned to act as if he had already passed away. Because he was aware of the cave's reputation for being dangerous, he decided that Vortex Spring would be the ideal place. There is a possibility that disappearance could occur there. For several weeks or perhaps months leading up to the 18th of August, he worked on getting everything ready. It is possible that he was gradually removing the things that were most important to him from his trailer, things that he would require in order to start a new life. It's possible that he was putting money aside or developing a new identity at the time. A significant amount of cash was reportedly withdrawn from his account just before he disappeared, according to the reports. The strategy was put into action on the evening when he vanished without a trace. He puts on some of his gear and makes a show of going for a dive in order to make sure that the personnel at the business notice him. On the other hand, it's possible that he didn't even enter the water at all, or that he merely conducted a very brief dive that was shallow. It is a purposeful red herring, a piece of misleading evidence that he leaves behind the 2 air tanks in order to make the investigation more difficult to understand. After that, he sneaks out while it is still dark outside for shelter. The possibility exists that he has a getaway automobile hidden in a nearby location, or that he has an accomplice waiting to pick him up. In order to sell the story that he met his end in the spring, he abandons his truck, his wallet, and one of his phones, along with the rest of his belongings. He gives up his dog, which is a terrible reality, but an essential component of the strategy. In an instant, Ben McDaniel vanishes from existence, and a new individual emerges, liberated from the burden of debt and the anguish of a troubled history. Additionally, the data that supports this viewpoint is significant. He is experiencing severe mental and financial stress, which gives a great motivation. There is no physical evidence of a struggle or a body, which is a strong indicator that the crime in question is not a murder. It is more sanitary. Over the course of the years, there have been a number of unverified sightings of persons that resembled Ben in various regions of the country, and even in countries outside of the United States. A few days after he was said to have vanished, a waitress in a nearby town was convinced that she had given him breakfast. The theory is maintained by these sightings, despite the fact that none of them have ever been authenticated. It is a tantalizing possibility that Ben outwitted everyone and successfully started a new life, leaving his family to live in a state of uncertainty for the rest of their lives. While the investigation into Ben McDaniel's disappearance became less active during the years that followed, the mystery continued to grow more perplexing. In the official sense, it is still a case of a missing person. The year 2013 marked the year that Ben was officially pronounced dead, 3 years after he had been last seen. This permitted his parents to take care of his estate. Nevertheless, the legal pronouncement was of very little significance to them. The funeral was never held by them. In no way did they ever erect a headstone. In their hearts, they were unable to mourn the loss of a son whose future was still a total mystery. Both emotionally and financially, Shelby and Patty McDaniel were subjected to a mountain of hardship. They used their own money to pay for private detectives, prizes, and private search attempts, which totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. They exerted a great deal of effort in order to keep the case of their son in the public view, with the expectation that somebody, somewhere, would come forward with the piece of information that would eventually break the case open. They felt that the first investigation was bungled and that their suspicions of foul play were never taken seriously enough. As a result, they became extremely upset with the Walton County Sheriff's Office. The authorities, on the other hand, contended that they were unable to take any action because they did not have a body or any other tangible evidence related to the crime. The investigation was a frustrating mix of peculiar occurrences and theories that had not been examined in depth. In spite of the fact that they are at the core of the family's suspicions, the staff at Vortex Spring have always maintained their claims of innocence. They have not wavered from their narrative, which states that Ben was a careless diver who met a horrible end in the cave, regardless of whether or not his body was situated there. For years, they have been subjected to accusations on the internet and scrutiny from the general public, but no charges have ever been brought against them. The circumstances surrounding Ben McDaniel's disappearance continue to cast a pall over Vortex Spring, despite the fact that it continues to function as a popular diving hole. Ben's story has become a modern legend among the larger community of people who are interested in real crime and those who are divers. It has been discussed endlessly on internet forums and in films. There is a thorough examination of every aspect, including the tanks, the dive record, and the witness statements. The opinions of individuals are sharply divided amongst the three hypotheses. Was it a bizarre accident in which a corpse was lost in a manner that defies all logic and experience for the reason that it was lost? Could it have been a cold-blooded murder that was then covered up in a flawless manner? On the other hand, was it the most extreme kind of flight, a man who pretended to die in order to begin a new life? After everything is said and done, the case leaves us with a spooky silence. The truth about what took place at Vortex Spring on the 18th of August 2010 is nearly impossible to discern, despite the fact that the water there is completely transparent. It is only Ben McDaniel himself who is aware of the events that took place with absolute certainty. There is a possibility that his family will never receive the justice that they have battled so hard for if he was murdered. Those who murdered him may have been able to get away with the perfect crime. In addition, if he had fabricated his own disappearance, he would have left his parents in a painful state of limbo where they would be unable to grieve and would be unable to move on with their lives. During the time that they are locked in a nightmare of not knowing, they are left to worry each and every day whether or not their kid is still alive from somewhere in the world. Ben was meant to be able to escape through the cave, but in the end, it turned out to be a perpetual jail, not for his body, but for the truth and its contents. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up?